After my husband died, I became a single mother to infant twins with nothing but medical debt and a broken heart. My wealthy parents refused to help us, calling my late husband a bad investment. They threw us out, but my humble in-laws took us in. Years later, I quietly sold the dusty horse ranch they helped me buy for $200 million. When my parents and my golden child sister showed up at the most exclusive gala in Atlanta to secure a bailout for their failing company, I revealed my gift for the people who actually saved me. Their faces froze in absolute horror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. Get that cheap diaper bag off the VIP chair right now, Maya. The sharp voice belonged to my white brother-in-law, Bradley. He kicked the strap of my tote bag so hard it slid across the polished marble floor of the Atlanta Heritage Club. I paused, holding the hands of my 5-year-old twins, Leo and Luna. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped immediately. Dozens of Atlanta high society elite turned their heads to watch the commotion. Bradley straightened his tailored suit, his face flushed with arrogance. "This table is for million-dollar investors and official family," he sneered, looking down at my simple dress. "It is not for widows who smell like horse manure in desperation. Take your crying kids and go find a seat in the kitchen with the catering staff. You are ruining my networking opportunities." I did not raise my voice. I bent down to pick up my bag, expecting my parents to intervene. My mother, Beatrice, the self-proclaimed queen of our church congregation, stepped forward in her designer gown. But instead of reprimanding Bradley, she grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Do not make a scene and embarrass this family again," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Have you no shame showing up here looking like a stable hand?" I looked my mother in the eyes. "I was invited, Mother. It is a community charity gala." Her lips curled in disgust. "4 years ago you dragged these brats to my doorstep begging for money to pay Marcus' hospital bills. I told you then the Sterling family does not fund failures. You threw your life away the minute you dropped out of Spelman College to marry that nobody instead of going to law school like your sister Chloe. Now look at you, shoveling horse dirt while Chloe is the vice president of a real estate empire. Just do as Bradley says and get out of our sight." My father, Winston, stood right behind her, adjusting his expensive tie. He refused to even make eye contact with my children. "Listen to your mother, Maya," he muttered dismissively. "Bradley is closing a massive deal tonight that will save our company. We cannot have you jeopardizing our image. Go sit in the back." My sister Chloe sauntered over, a glass of champagne in her hand, and a smug smile plastered across her face. She looked me up and down, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. "Honestly, Maya, I do not know why you bother showing up to these things," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "You are completely socially unfit for this environment. Why do you not just go back to your little farm and play in the mud?" I looked at the 3 people who shared my blood. I looked at the man my sister married. They had spent my entire life making me feel small, treating my quiet nature and my choice to build a simple life as a disease. When my husband was dying, they locked their gates. They let me drown. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply smiled, a calm, chilling smile that made my mother take a slight step back. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said softly. "I should go sit with my real family." I turned my back on all of them and confidently walked across the grand, sparkling ballroom. I guided my twins past the tables of whispering socialites straight toward the back corner near the kitchen doors. There, sitting quietly in their modest Sunday clothes, were Pastor James and Sarah, my late husband's parents. They opened their arms immediately, pulling Leo and Luna into warm embraces. Sarah gently kissed my cheek, her brown eyes full of deep understanding. They were the ones who had remortgaged their small house to buy me that dusty patch of land 4 years ago, when I had absolutely nothing left. As I sat down next to the only people who had ever shown me unconditional love, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from view. It was a secure message from my lead corporate attorney. The text was short, but it carried the weight of absolute victory. "The ink is dry on the contract," the message read. $200 million has been successfully transferred to your private accounts. We have officially purchased all of Bradley corporate debt and the banknotes on the Sterling estate. You own them now. I calmly locked my phone and looked across the crowded room. Chloe was laughing, tossing her head back as Bradley handed her another drink. My parents were busy shaking hands with wealthy investors, projecting the illusion of untouchable power. They thought they had just put the poor, pathetic scapegoat of the family back in her place. They had no idea that the silent widow sitting in the back corner was the anonymous tech billionaire who held their entire existence in the palm of her hand. Their absolute ruin was already written, and I was going to enjoy watching them lose everything tonight. 2 days later, my phone rang with a summons I had not received in 4 years. My father demanded my immediate presence for Sunday dinner at the Sterling estate. I did not bring Leo and Luna. I walked through the massive mahogany doubled doors of my childhood home in Buckhead, completely alone, carrying only a sleek leather handbag. The grand dining room table was meticulously set with my mother's vintage silver and crystal, but the atmosphere inside the room was as cold as a morgue. My father Winston sat at the head of the table, perfectly postured in his expensive weekend cashmere. My mother Beatrice sat to his right, swirling a glass of dark Merlot. Across from them sat my golden child sister Chloe and her husband Bradley, who was still wearing the exact same smug expression from the country club incident. Nobody offered me a drink. Nobody asked how my twins were doing. "Sit down, Maya," my father commanded, pointing a rigid finger to the hard wooden chair at the opposite end of the long table. "We do not have time for pleasantries today. We are offering you a lifeline, and I expect you to take it with gratitude." I pulled out the heavy chair and sat down, crossing my legs. "I am listening," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. My father slid a thick legal document across the polished oak surface. It stopped right in front of my empty porcelain plate. "Bradley has generously agreed to take that useless dirt patch off your hands." My father explained, his tone flat and unyielding. "He is offering $50,000 for your horse ranch. It is significantly more than that rundown property is worth, but we are family. We take care of our own." I looked down at the printed contract, and then slowly looked up at Bradley. He leaned back in his chair, steepled his manicured fingers, and gave me a highly condescending smile. "Let us be realistic here," Maya, Bradley said, his tone dripping with corporate arrogance. "You are a single black mother trying to play farmer on a piece of land you absolutely cannot afford to maintain. Real estate is a complex, aggressive game. It requires capital vision and a certain type of intellect. You are drowning in property taxes and horse feed bills. Just take the 50 grand right now, pay off whatever debts Marcus left you, and find a nice little apartment in the suburbs. Let the professionals handle the land." I did not touch the contract. I just stared at Bradley, letting the heavy silence stretch until he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You want my land for $50,000? I asked softly. My mother slammed her wineglass down on the table. "Do not use that ungrateful tone with us," she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "Bradley is doing you a massive favor. You have always been financially irresponsible. You dropped out of Spelman to marry a man who left you with nothing but medical debt and 2 mouths to feed." Chloe chimed in, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her expensive silk shoulder. "Seriously, Maya, you should be thanking him on your knees. You never had a head for the future. That is exactly why Mom and Dad gave me your college fund." I turned my calm gaze directly to my sister. "You mean the college fund that paid for your lavish destination wedding in Lake Como?" I asked. "The one you justified taking because I was grieving my husband, and therefore ruining the family aesthetic?" Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, please stop playing the victim, Maya. I needed that money to secure my social standing in the city. I actually had a future to build with a Wall Street executive. I was networking with European investors while you were cleaning out dirty horse stalls." Mom and Dad made a smart business decision. They invested in the daughter who brings actual value to the Sterling name. You were a bad investment then, and you are a bad investment now. Just sign the paper and take the handout before we change our minds. My father tapped the table impatiently. "Enough history. The 50,000 is a generous buyout. My manufacturing firm is restructuring and Bradley needs the tax write-off that your agricultural zoning provides. Sign the contract, Maya. We will wire the money tomorrow morning, and you will be completely out of our hair." I looked at the four of them registering their absolute entitlement. The sheer arrogant belief that they held all the power in this room. They thought I was the exact same broken widow they had discarded 4 years ago. They thought I was desperate enough to hand over a 5,000-acre property sitting directly on top of the largest untapped lithium deposit in the state. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. I picked up the contract. Bradley smiled, reaching into his suit jacket to offer me a silver pen. I ignored the silver pen. I grasped the thick stack of legal paper and calmly ripped it straight down the middle. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly in the dining room. My mother gasped in pure horror. My father half rose from his chair, his face flushing dark red with fury. "What do you think you are doing?" my father shouted, slamming his fist on the table. I placed the torn halves of the contract on my plate. Then I unclasped my leather handbag. I reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it squarely onto Bradley's plate with a loud thud. "I do not need your $50,000, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "But the Securities and Exchange Commission might want to know why you transferred $5 million of my father's retirement fund to a shell company in the Cayman Islands last Tuesday." The fallout of Bradley going pale was still fresh in my mind when I walked into the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. It was the annual alumni luncheon for Atlanta's most elite African American sorority. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in white silk. The room was filled with judges, surgeons, and corporate executives. I wore a simple black dress holding a glass of sparkling water. I was enjoying the quiet atmosphere until the sharp clacking of designer heels echoed across the marble floor. Chloe had arrived. My sister wore a bright pink Chanel suit, her face contoured to perfection. She spotted me immediately. Her eyes locked onto mine with the predatory gleam of a woman who needed an audience to feel powerful. She marched straight toward my table, making sure her voice carried over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the barn," Chloe announced, her voice slicing through the elegant chatter. Dozens of women turned their heads, their conversations halting instantly. Chloe stopped 2 feet in front of me, looking me up and down with exaggerated disgust. "I am honestly shocked security let you pass the lobby, Maya. This luncheon is for women who actually finished their degrees at Spelman, not dropouts who quit to marry broke men." I kept my face perfectly still. I took a slow sip of my water. "Hello, Chloe," I said quietly. "It is nice to see you too." My calm response only fueled her anger. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to look unhinged. She wanted to prove to every successful woman in this room that I was beneath them. Chloe turned to the women at the adjacent tables, gesturing toward me like I was a circus exhibit. "Can you believe this audacity?" Chloe asked the crowd. "My sister lives on a filthy horse farm. She relies on her elderly in-laws to feed her children. Our parents had to ban her from the country club just last week because she showed up looking like a complete charity case." The women exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some whispered behind their hands. The humiliation was supposed to break me. It was the same tactic my family had used for decades. They isolated me, shamed me publicly, and expected me to run away crying. "You are a stain on this family legacy," Maya, Chloe sneered, stepping closer. "You bring absolutely no value to our name. You drag down our reputation every time you show your face in public. Why do you not just leave and go back to begging your pastor father-in-law for grocery money? You are socially unfit to be in this room." I did not blink. I did not defend Marcus. I did not explain that Pastor James and Sarah had given me love when my own blood gave me nothing. I simply let Chloe finish her tantrum. The ballroom remained dead silent. The sorority president, a highly respected federal judge named Patricia, stepped up to the podium at the front of the room. She cleared her throat, trying to break the heavy tension Chloe had just created. "Ladies," Patricia said into the microphone, "let us remember why we are gathered here today. We are raising funds for the future generations of young Black women. Our annual charity drive supports full academic scholarships for underprivileged girls in Atlanta. We need to raise $2 million to secure this program for the next 10 years. I ask you to open your hearts and your checkbooks. Every contribution matters." Chloe smirked at me, crossing her arms over her chest. Did you hear that, Maya? Chloe asked loudly. They need actual money, not coupons, not sob stories about your dead husband. Actual money. Why do you not excuse yourself before they pass the collection plate? You are embarrassing yourself by standing here. I reached into my small leather clutch. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe away tears. I pulled out a sleek black checkbook and a fountain pen. I walked away from Chloe and moved directly toward the podium. The eyes of every woman in the ballroom followed my every step. I stood in front of Patricia. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and confusion. I uncapped my pen and quickly wrote out a number. I signed my name with a steady hand. I tore the check from the booklet and placed it softly onto the podium. Thank you for your leadership, Patricia, I said, clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent room. Please use this to fully fund the scholarship program for the next 10 years. No young woman should ever be denied an education because of financial struggles. I turned around and began walking back toward the exit. Behind me, I heard Patricia gasp. The sound was so sharp and loud it echoed through the microphone. Ladies! Patricia stammered, her voice shaking with absolute shock. We have just received a single donation to cover our entire goal. Maya Caldwell has just donated $2 million in cash. The ballroom erupted. Women gasped, dropping their napkins and clapping their hands over their mouths. A wave of stunned applause began to ripple through the crowd. I kept walking, my expression completely unchanged. I approached the spot where Chloe was standing. Chloe was frozen. Her face had turned pale gray. She stared at me, her mind unable to process what happened. That is fake, Chloe whispered frantically, her voice trembling. That check is going to bounce. You do not have $2 million. You are broke. You clean horse stalls. You are nothing. I stopped next to her. I leaned in close, letting the scent of my custom perfume wash over her terrified face. I smiled at my sister. By the way, I just bought the lease to your boutique in Midtown. Your rent triples on the first of the month. Pack your bags. The dust barely settled on the driveway when the sharp crunch of expensive tires announced unwelcome visitors. I stood near the main paddock brushing down a rescue mare, while Leo and Luna chased a barn cat near the wooden porch. The serenity of the therapeutic ranch shattered the moment my father parked his silver Mercedes. Winston and Beatrice stormed out of the vehicle. A man in a cheap pinstripe suit carrying a faux leather briefcase trailed closely behind them. My parents realized my financial power, and their response was not humility. It was full-blown panic masked as aggression. I handed the grooming brush to a stable hand and placed myself between my parents and my children. What are you doing on my property? I calmly asked. My father pointed a trembling finger at the barn. This is exactly what we are talking about, Winston barked loudly. Look at this filth. You have our grandchildren running around in the mud like feral animals. We will not allow the Sterling bloodline to be dragged through the mud just because you insist on playing peasant. The man in the cheap pinstripe suit stepped forward, clearing his throat. Miss Caldwell, I am Arthur Vance, legal counsel for your parents. We are here to formally inform you of our intent to file for emergency grandparents' rights. This environment is highly detrimental to the physical and psychological well-being of the minors. My mother pushed past the lawyer, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. You think you can buy your sister out of her business and flaunt your real estate tricks, Beatrice shrieked. You think some lucky payout makes you independent. You are still the same pathetic girl who married a nobody. Marcus was a penniless charity case who left you with massive hospital bills and 2 mouths you could not feed. We are taking the twins, Maya. They deserve to be raised in high society, surrounded by culture and wealth, not horse manure. I felt a freezing cold rage settle deeply in my chest. You do not care about Leo and Luna, I said. You only care about control. You care that you can no longer dictate my life. You will never touch my children. Beatrice scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. We have the best family court judge in Atlanta on our payroll. We will drag your name through the mud. We will testify that your grief made you mentally unstable. By the time we are done, you will beg us to take them. A deep booming voice resonated from the wooden porch, stopping my mother mid-sentence. You will do no such thing. Pastor James stepped down the wooden stairs, his presence commanding the space. Sarah walked quietly beside him, her eyes locked on my parents with protective intensity. James walked over to stand right beside me. His voice did not need to shout to carry absolute authority. Winston Sterling, you stand on this land, talking about what these children deserve. James began, his tone laced with righteous fury. Where was your concern 4 years ago when Marcus was suffocating in an intensive care unit? Where was your high society wealth when she begged you for a loan to keep her family from drowning? You slammed your iron gates in her face. You told her she was a bad investment. My father puffed out his chest. That was tough love, James. We were trying to teach her a lesson. You are a fool, Winston James countered, stepping closer. Tough love is showing up when it is hard. What you did was abandonment. You threw away your own daughter. You have no moral standing and no legal standing. We provided the roof over these children when you provided nothing but judgment. The lawyer. Arthur pulled a document from his briefcase, tapping it nervously. Pastor, the court looks at financial stability. My clients have the means to provide a superior lifestyle. My clients have the Sterling estate. You have a small parsonage and a struggling farm. This is a matter of resource allocation. Beatrice smiled triumphantly, reaching toward Leo and Luna, who were hiding behind Sarah. Come to Grandma, she cooed. We are going to take you to a real house. We are going to buy you whatever you want. Just as she stepped forward, the low rumble of heavy engines vibrated through the ground. 3 black armored SUVs turned onto the driveway, kicking up dust. They drove in perfect formation, surrounding my parents' Mercedes. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously. 6 men stepped out dressed in tactical black suits. They moved with the precision of highly trained professionals. They were former Secret Service agents, the security detail I hired when the $200 million transfer cleared. The lead agent walked straight up to Arthur and snatched the emergency filing documents right out of his hands. What is the meaning of this? Winston yelled, as the security team formed a solid wall between him and the ranch house. Maya, you cannot intimidate us with rented muscle. I did not rent them, Dad, I said, pulling a stamped legal document from my pocket. I employ them. I handed the document to my mother. She stared at the bold red court seal. Beatrice read the paper. It is a permanent restraining order, I explained, my voice slicing through the morning air. Signed by a judge at 8 this morning. It covers me, my children, James, Sarah, and this property. Arthur looked at the document and began backing away toward the Mercedes. Mr. Sterling, I advise we leave right now, Arthur muttered. This is a federal order. Winston glared at me. You think you can keep us off this farm, Maya? It is a tiny patch of dirt. I own half the real estate in Buckhead. I will bury you. I looked around at the rolling green hills and the vast horizon stretching out behind the barn. I smiled. Step off my 5,000 acres. My parents stared at me with open mouths. Winston clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth might shatter right there on the wooden porch. Beatrice looked from the towering former Secret Service agents to my unwavering gaze. They had absolutely no choice. They turned around in total defeat, getting into their silver Mercedes and speeding down the long gravel driveway. The dust settled over the ranch, leaving a profound silence in their wake. Pastor James nodded at me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder, before he and Sarah went inside to check on the twins. I stood on the porch watching the horizon, knowing the war was far from over. Cornered animals always lash out. That night the air grew thick and heavy with an impending summer storm. The ranch was bathed in pitch darkness, save for the ambient glow of the moon reflecting off the grazing pastures. I was wide awake, sitting in the dark of my home office, reviewing the financial dossiers my legal team had compiled on Bradley. My brother-in-law was a desperate man. His entire identity was wrapped up in corporate superiority and untouchable white privilege. With his Cayman Islands shell company exposed to the authorities, he was facing imminent financial ruin and public humiliation. At 2 in the morning, a silent alert flashed across my encrypted security monitor. A perimeter breach at the southern fence line, near the main horse barn, had just triggered the silent alarms. I did not panic. I simply tapped a button on my desk console, alerting my security team. I watched the live infrared feed on my screen. A figure dressed in expensive dark clothing was slipping through the side entrance of the barn. It was Bradley. He was frantically rummaging through the feed bins and the small tack room, searching for a safe, a lockbox, or any scrap of paper he could use to blackmail me. He thought I was hiding offshore accounts or illicit funds in the barn like some amateur. His desperation made him sloppy. The infrared camera captured him moving toward the back stall. That was where I kept a small private memorial for Marcus. It held his framed college graduation photo, his favorite leather riding boots, and the brass compass he carried during his illness. Bradley stopped in front of it. Instead of moving past it, his frustration boiled over into cruel destruction. He grabbed the framed photo and smashed it against the wooden post. He kicked the boots across the dirt floor and knocked the table over, destroying the only physical sanctuary I had built for my late husband. I did not scream. I stood up from my desk and walked calmly out the back door of the ranch house. My lead security chief, a former military operative named David, fell into step right beside me. We crossed the dark yard in absolute silence. When we reached the barn doors, Bradley was still inside, kicking at the broken glass of my husband's photograph. He thought he was completely untraceable, a ghost in the night, executing a flawless corporate espionage mission. David reached over and flipped the main breaker. 24 industrial halogen lights snapped on simultaneously, flooding the massive barn with blinding white light. Bradley froze in his tracks. He threw his hands up to shield his eyes, dropping a metal crowbar into the dirt with a loud clank. He blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the sudden intense glare. When his vision cleared, he saw me standing at the entrance with my arms crossed. David stood slightly ahead of me, resting his hands casually on his tactical belt. Bradley immediately straightened his posture, attempting to salvage his dignity. He brushed the dust off his designer slacks and puffed out his chest, trying to project the arrogant authority of a high-powered executive. Maya. What a surprise, Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension and fake charm. I was just taking a late-night drive to clear my head. Your property lines are terribly marked. I took a wrong turn off the county road and got lost looking for the highway. You really should invest in some better lighting or a security gate. I came in here looking for someone to ask for directions, but it seems you keep a rather messy operation. He kicked a piece of the broken picture frame out of his way, maintaining a smug, defiant smile. He actually believed his status and his skin color made him untouchable. He believed he could break into a black woman's property, destroy her husband's memorial, and simply talk his way out of it with a polite, arrogant excuse. I stepped forward, crushing a piece of the shattered glass beneath my boot. I looked at the ruined memorial, and then looked directly into Bradley's panicked eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him an ounce of the rage burning inside my chest. You did not get lost, Bradley, I said, my voice echoing off the high wooden rafters. You drove past 3 no trespassing signs, cut a padlock on the southern gate, and crept through the mud in your Italian loafers to find dirt on me to save your own skin. Bradley let out a short, arrogant laugh, crossing his arms defensively. You have absolutely no proof of that, Maya. It is my word against yours, and we both know who the authorities in this county are going to believe. You are just a hysterical widow making wild accusations. I am going to walk out of here right now, and there is nothing you can do about it. I slowly raised my hand and pointed toward the ceiling. Tucked discreetly into the wooden beams, completely invisible in the dark, were a dozen state-of-the-art lenses. I recently upgraded the ranch, Bradley, I said softly. Those are hidden 4K night vision cameras with audio recording. They just captured you breaking and entering, destroying private property, and attempting to tamper with evidence. Bradley's smug smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the harsh halogen lights. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked up at the ceiling and then back at the security chief, blocking the only exit. You did not just commit breaking and entering, Bradley, I continued, stepping right into his personal space. You just violated your bail conditions from the quiet little wire fraud investigation I triggered yesterday. David stepped forward and secured Bradley's hands behind his back with industrial zip ties. Bradley dropped to his knees in the dirt, begging me to let him go, promising he would sign whatever I wanted. I ignored him, kneeling to carefully gather the shattered pieces of Marcus's photograph. The police arrived exactly 7 minutes later. I handed them the unedited 4K video file. They hauled my brother-in-law away in the back of a squad car, his arrogant corporate privilege entirely stripped away in the glare of the flashing blue and red lights. 2 days later, the humid Atlanta Sunday morning sun beat down on the stained glass windows of Grace Fellowship Church. I sat in the front pew between my twins and Sarah. Pastor James was greeting the congregation, his warm smile radiating genuine love for his community. This building was modest. The carpets were worn and the wooden pews creaked, but it was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. The peaceful atmosphere shattered the moment the heavy double doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. My father Winston and my mother Beatrice strode down the center aisle. They wore their Sunday best, projecting an image of wealthy, untouchable grace. Winston wore a tailored navy suit. Beatrice wore a pristine white dress with a matching wide-brimmed hat. They took seats in the third row, positioning themselves perfectly in the sight line of the entire congregation. The murmurs began instantly. My parents had not stepped foot in a church in decades, unless it was to be photographed for a charity gala. They were not here to worship. They were here to launch a public relations offensive. With Bradley sitting in a county jail cell and their financial crimes exposed, they were desperate to control the narrative. They wanted to publicly brand me as a crazy grieving widow to protect their own social standing. The service transitioned into the time of open testimony. This was a cherished tradition at Grace Fellowship, a time for members to share their burdens and blessings. Beatrice did not wait for the microphone to be passed. She stood up, smoothed her expensive skirt, and marched directly to the front of the church. She gripped the wooden stand holding the microphone and bowed her head. When she looked up, her eyes were brimming with perfectly manufactured tears. Brothers and sisters, Beatrice began, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical sorrow. I stand before you today, not as a proud businesswoman, but as a broken-hearted mother. I come asking for your prayers for my daughter Maya. The sanctuary grew uncomfortably silent. I felt Sarah stiffen beside me, her hand gripping my arm. I did not move. I stared directly at my mother, waiting for the poison to spill. My daughter suffered a terrible tragedy when she lost her husband. Beatrice continued, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. The grief has completely fractured her mind. She has isolated herself on a filthy, dangerous farm. She is keeping our precious grandchildren locked away in squalor. We have tried everything to bring her home to a safe, clean environment. We have offered her money, housing, and top-tier psychiatric care. But she is being manipulated. Beatrice turned and pointed a dramatic, trembling finger directly at Pastor James and Sarah. She is being held hostage by people who are preying on her mental instability. People who look at her bank account and see a sudden payout they can exploit. We are begging you, as her church family, help us save our daughter from these opportunists. The congregation gasped. The sheer audacity of her accusation hung heavy in the humid air. Beatrice was trying to turn my only real family into criminals. She wanted the city of Atlanta to believe I was insane, so she could seize my assets and my children under the guise of maternal concern. Winston sat in the pew, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the deeply concerned patriarch. I felt the heat of pure rage burning in my throat, but I did not break my composure. I knew screaming would only give them the hysterical reaction they desperately wanted. Pastor James stepped out from behind the pulpit. He did not rush. He did not yell. He walked with the slow, heavy grace of a man who had spent his entire life fighting spiritual warfare. He stood beside Beatrice, gently taking this microphone from her hand. He did not ask her to sit down. He left her standing there, exposed under the bright sanctuary lights. James opened his worn leather Bible. The sound of the turning pages was the only noise in the room. He looked down at the text, and then he raised his eyes to meet Winston's gaze. Matthew chapter 23. Pastor James read, his deep baritone voice rumbling through the church like an approaching storm. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. James closed the Bible. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. We have people in this world who wear designer clothes to mask their spiritual poverty. James preached, his voice echoing with absolute authority. People who lock their iron gates when their own flesh and blood is dying, only to kick down the doors when they smell money. Pride and greed will always try to dress themselves up as righteous concern. They will shed tears for an audience. They will weaponize their wealth to crush the vulnerable. But God sees the ledger of your heart. You cannot buy your way out of moral bankruptcy. Winston's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He gripped the edge of the wooden pew so hard his knuckles turned white. Beatrice stood frozen at the front, her fake tears drying instantly into a mask of pure humiliated fury. The congregation murmured in powerful agreement, sensing the absolute truth in their pastor's words. I knew the sermon was perfectly executed, but I decided it was time to deliver the final blessing. I stood up from the front pew. I smoothed my simple black dress and picked up my handbag. I walked slowly past my mother, not giving her a single glance. I bypassed the offering plates at the front and walked directly to Deacon Hayes, the elderly church treasurer, who sat in the front row holding the financial ledgers. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick certified envelope. I handed it to him. "What is this, Maya Deacon?" Hayes asked, his voice shaking slightly as he felt the heavy seal on the envelope. I turned to face the congregation. I looked at the sea of faces. The people who had fed me, prayed for me, and carried me when I was completely broken. Then I locked eyes with Winston and Beatrice. When my husband was dying in a hospital bed, my parents told me I was a bad investment. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. When I had nothing but debt and a broken heart, this church took up offerings to keep my lights on. Pastor James and Sarah remortgaged their home to give me a future. My parents just stood in God's house and told you I am being manipulated for financial gain. They think money is the only reason people show kindness because their own hearts are empty. So let me clear the ledger today. Deacon Hayes opened the envelope. He pulled out the official stamped county document. He adjusted his glasses, reading the text. His hands began to tremble violently. He looked up at Pastor James, tears instantly spilling over his cheeks. "It is the deed," Deacon Hayes shouted, his voice breaking with overwhelming emotion. "She paid it off. The entire 20-year mortgage is gone. The church is completely debt-free." The congregation erupted. People jumped to their feet, cheering, raising their hands, and weeping openly. The sound of their joy was deafening, a massive wave of pure triumph washing over the sanctuary. I walked back down the aisle toward my children. I stopped directly in front of the pew where Winston was sitting. Beatrice had hurried back to his side, looking completely defeated. I leaned in close, my voice cutting perfectly through the roar of the cheering crowd. "Your money makes you a hostage to your own greed," I whispered smoothly. "My money makes me free. Now get out of my church." Winston's face lost all color. He stumbled backward as if physically struck by the absolute weight of my words. Beatrice grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging deeply into his suit jacket. They practically fled down the center aisle, the joyous hallelujahs of the congregation chasing them out the heavy wooden doors. They came to destroy my reputation and left completely stripped of their own. Exactly 1 month later, the opulent grand ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel hummed with the frantic, nervous energy of Atlanta's elite. The Excellence in Real Estate Gala was the premier social event of the season. It was a place where fortunes were built and destroyed over crystal flutes of imported champagne and plates of beluga caviar. Tonight, however, the usual arrogant posturing was eclipsed by a single manic obsession. Every broker, investor, and high society socialite in the room was buzzing about a phantom buyer. An anonymous tech entity had spent the last 30 days ruthlessly acquiring the entire Northern Valley. It was not just a few buildings. They had purchased the defunct industrial parks, the sprawling retail spaces, the luxury residential developments that had stalled during the recession, and every prime piece of untouched land. It had all been swallowed up in a series of massive, untraceable cash transactions routed through a web of impenetrable corporate trusts. The city's power brokers were terrified and fascinated in equal measure. Standing near a towering swan ice sculpture were my parents, along with my sister Chloe and her disgraced husband Bradley. They looked the part of high society royalty, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth, but I knew the pathetic truth. My security team's forensic accountants had been tracking their rapidly deteriorating accounts for weeks. They were completely and utterly bankrupt. Bradley's mounting legal defense for his wire fraud and trespassing charges was draining their remaining liquidity dry. He was sweating profusely, checking his phone every 10 seconds, paranoid that the authorities were tracking his every move. Winston's primary lenders had finally called in his massive commercial loans, refusing to grant him any more extensions. They were drowning in a sea of debt, facing imminent foreclosure on their own estate. Yet here they stood, draped in rented Valentino gowns and leased diamond cufflinks, hoping no one would notice the desperate panic in their eyes. They were hunting. Winston was desperately scanning the crowded room, hoping to corner the anonymous billionaire for a miraculous bailout. He actually believed his old sterling charm could secure a lifeline and save his crumbling empire. I watched them from the shadows of the private VIP balcony, directly above the main floor, holding a glass of sparkling water. I saw Pastor James and Sarah enter the grand lobby below. They looked incredibly dignified. James wore his Sunday preaching suit, a modest but immaculate charcoal two-piece. Sarah walked beside him wearing a simple, elegant navy dress. They were my invited guests, holding premium VIP credentials, but they lingered near the coat check, taking in the dazzling, spectacular environment with quiet grace. Chloe spotted them first. I watched her whisper to Beatrice, pointing her champagne flute at the couple with an expression of utter disgust. Like sharks drawn to a drop of blood in the water, the four of them immediately converged on James and Sarah. I leaned over the brass railing, listening intently, as their voices carried up through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Pastor James. Chloe sneered, her voice deliberately loud enough to turn the heads of nearby wealthy guests. Are you lost? The Soup Kitchen charity drive is on the lower level. This is a private gala for actual professionals. You must have taken a wrong turn at the subway station. Sarah calmly linked her arm through her husband's, refusing to shrink under Chloe's malicious glare. We were invited, Chloe. We know exactly where we are. Beatrice let out a harsh, brittle laugh, adjusting her rented diamond necklace, as if to prove her superiority. Invited by whom? Beatrice mocked, dripping with condescension. The catering staff. Please do not embarrass yourselves. You do not belong here among people of influence. You are severely underdressed and completely out of your depth. Winston puffed out his chest, trying to project an authority he no longer legally possessed. He stepped aggressively into Pastor James's personal space. You took advantage of my unstable daughter, Winston growled quietly, his eyes narrowing with venom. You manipulated Maya to pay off your little church building, but that pathetic scam ends tonight. We are about to meet the new owner of the valley, a real titan of industry. Once I secure a partnership with this billionaire, I will have the capital to bury your church in endless litigation until you are forced to sell it just to cover your legal fees. Pastor James did not flinch. He looked at Winston with an expression of profound pity that seemed to enrage my father even more. You are chasing ghosts, Winston James said, his voice steady and calm. You are building a house on sand and wondering why your feet are constantly wet. Bradley sneered, stepping forward to stand beside my father. He was twitching slightly, the pressure of his impending criminal trial fraying his nerves. You are out of your depth, old man, Bradley threatened. We are closing a 9-figure partnership tonight. You and Maya are finished. You should leave right now before I have security throw you out for violating the dress code. Before James could respond, the soft jazz music echoing through the ballroom suddenly faded into absolute silence. The massive crystal chandeliers dimmed, casting a dramatic hush over the hundreds of guests. A single brilliant spotlight illuminated the grand landing of the sweeping marble staircase at the center of the room. The event MC stepped up to the podium on the main stage, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, commanding total attention. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, his voice vibrating with palpable excitement. Please direct your attention to the grand staircase to welcome the visionary, who just closed the largest land acquisition in state history. A blinding white spotlight swept across the vaulted ceiling and locked directly onto the top landing of the grand marble staircase. The soft hum of the ballroom instantly evaporated into a stunned, breathless silence. I stepped out of the shadows and into the glaring light. I wore a custom-made emerald silk gown that cascaded to the floor with heavy, expensive elegance. I wore absolutely no jewelry, refusing to drape myself in the flashy trinkets these people used to measure human worth. My power did not need to be accessorized. David and four of my top security agents dressed in immaculate tailored black tuxedos stepped out a fraction of a second later, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of muscle right behind me. Down on the ballroom floor, the reaction was instantaneous and violently physical. Beatrice lost all control of her hands. Her crystal champagne flute slipped through her fingers, dropping to the polished marble floor with a sharp, violent shatter that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Winston turned the color of wet ash. His jaw slackened and his eyes bulged as the catastrophic reality of his situation violently rewired his brain. The anonymous billionaire he had been desperately hunting all night, the invisible titan holding the deeds to his crumbling empire and the keys to his financial survival, was the very daughter he had discarded. Bradley actually stumbled backward, his polished dress shoes slipping on the spilled champagne. He crashed heavily into a cocktail table, sending a silver tray of caviar crashing to the floor. The arrogant smirk he had worn just moments ago was entirely obliterated, replaced by the hollow, frantic terror of a man staring directly at his executioner. Chloe stood frozen in her rented designer gown, her mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of shock. The cruel, mocking laughter she had just directed at my guests died completely in her throat, leaving her gasping for air like a landed fish. I began my descent. I did not rush. I took each marble step with deliberate, agonizing precision. The sea of Atlanta's most powerful real estate moguls, politicians, and socialites parted for me like the Red Sea. They stepped back respectfully, clearing a wide path across the ballroom floor. Whispers began to ripple through the elite crowd as they scrambled to identify the woman commanding the room. They recognized my security team. They recognized the absolute authority in my posture. They were witnessing the unveiling of the new apex predator in their financial ecosystem. I reached the bottom of the staircase and walked directly toward the center of the room, where my biological family stood trembling. Winston's survival instinct frantically tried to override his humiliation. I watched his mind snap back to his lifelong default setting of toxic, opportunistic greed. He actually believed he could spin this. He believed he could play the role of the proud father and somehow attach himself to my sudden, unimaginable wealth. He puffed out his chest, pasted a sickly, desperate smile onto his pale face, and took a step forward. He raised his hand, reaching out to me as if preparing to welcome me into an embrace. I did not break my stride. I did not blink. I did not even turn my head a fraction of an inch in his direction. I walked right past Winston Sterling, as if he were a pane of dirty glass. I treated my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law with the exact same suffocating indifference. I rendered them completely and utterly invisible in a room full of the most important people in the city. The ultimate insult to a family obsessed with image was to prove to the world that they simply did not matter. I walked straight up to Pastor James and Sarah. The crowd watched in absolute fascination as the billionaire who owned the valley bypassed the city's old money elite to greet a modest pastor and his wife. I smiled, my cold armor melting away instantly. I reached out and took Sarah's hands, squeezing them gently before leaning in to kiss her cheek. I turned to Pastor James and kissed his cheek as well. "Thank you for coming," I said softly, ensuring the surrounding power brokers heard the profound respect in my voice. "You are the only royalty in this room." James smiled, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "We would not have missed this for the world, Maya." I turned away from my true family and walked with absolute purpose toward the main stage. The event MC quickly stepped aside, handing me the microphone with a slight reverent bow. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, placing my hands firmly on the edges. I looked out over the sea of upturned faces, taking in the glittering gowns, the tailored suits, and the overwhelming anticipation vibrating in the room. Then I looked down into the crowd and locked eyes directly with Winston and Beatrice. They were standing exactly where I had left them, frozen in a puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal, thoroughly humiliated and entirely broken. They were bankrupt, completely exposed, and entirely at my mercy. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp thud echoed through the massive ballroom, demanding absolute silence. I leaned forward, keeping my gaze pinned to my parents' terrified eyes. Let me tell you a story about what happens when you throw a grieving mother out into the rain. Let me tell you a story about what happens when you throw a grieving mother out into the rain. The silence in the Biltmore ballroom was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the sharp intake of breath from the socialites in the front row. I gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, letting my gaze sweep across the sea of Atlanta's most ruthless power brokers. They were captivated. I did not need to shout. The microphone carried the quiet, dangerous clarity of my voice into every gilded corner of the room. 4 years ago, I sat in a sterile intensive care unit listening to the steady, terrifying beep of a heart monitor until that beep flatlined into a continuous, piercing tone. I walked out of that hospital a widow with 2 toddlers clutching my hands and completely buried in medical debt. I had nowhere to go. I had no safety net. So I did what any desperate child would do. I went to the sprawling, gated mansion of the people who brought me into this world. I stood on their immaculate, pristine porch in a torrential downpour, shivering and begging for a temporary roof over my children's heads. I paused, letting the image sink into the minds of the wealthy investors and real estate moguls staring up at me. The doors opened. I continued, my voice dropping an octave. But there was no embrace. There was no warmth. Instead, I was handed a black plastic trash bag containing the few sweaters and childhood keepsakes I had left in my old bedroom. I was told that grief was a burden. I was told that because I had married for love instead of for status, I was no longer their problem. As the rain soaked through my children's clothes, I was looked dead in the eye and told that I was a bad investment. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The whispers started instantly passing like a shockwave from table to table. These people were apex predators of capitalism, but even they had lines they did not cross. Everyone in that room knew exactly who I was and exactly who I was talking about. The Sterling family name was well known in this crowd. I shifted my gaze, dropping it directly onto Winston and Beatrice. They were standing exactly where I had left them near the ice sculpture. Winston was sweating profusely. Large damp patches were visibly blooming through the fabric of his rented tuxedo. He was frantically looking around, realizing that the very people he had come to beg for money were now looking at him with naked disgust. Beatrice was trembling so violently she had to grip a cocktail table to stay upright. Her face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. They were completely trapped in the blinding spotlight of high society judgment. They had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of philanthropic grace, and I had just publicly gutted it on the biggest stage in the city. Bradley looked like he was going to be sick. He took a step backward, trying to physically distance himself from my parents, trying to hide behind a group of investors. Chloe was staring at the floor, her face flushed with a humiliating deep red. The room was turning against them in real time, and they were entirely powerless to stop it. But this story is not about the people who left me to drown, I said, my voice lifting effortlessly above the whispers, cutting through the tension. This story is about true wealth. I turned away from my biological family and looked down at the coat check area where Pastor James and Sarah were standing. The crowd naturally followed my gaze. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with offshore accounts, leased sports cars, or the rented diamonds you wear to pretend you are solvent, I declared, staring directly at my parents again before turning my warm gaze back to James and Sarah. True wealth is character. It is sacrifice. It is what you do when there are no cameras rolling and no tax deductions to claim. That night, carrying my children through the freezing rain, I knocked on the door of a modest church parsonage. The couple who opened that door did not ask for my financial portfolio. They dried my children's hair. They fed us warm soup. They gave us their own bed. I stepped out from behind the podium, walking slowly across the massive stage. They did not stop there, I continued. When they realized I needed a way to provide for my twins, they took the only asset they possessed to their name. They remortgaged their modest home and emptied their meager retirement accounts. They took every cent they had and bought me a run-down, overgrown, filthy horse ranch on the edge of the Northern Valley. It was a place nobody wanted. It was a property the banks had written off as dead land. But they bought it because they believed in me. They invested in a grieving widow when my own flesh and blood threw me away. The ballroom was completely spellbound. Several prominent socialites were openly wiping tears from their eyes. The investors were leaning forward, hanging on my every word, sensing the monumental pivot that was about to occur. I walked back to the microphone. I looked out over the crowd, a sharp, brilliant smile spreading across my face. They bought me a patch of dirt to heal my soul, I said, leaning into the microphone. But it turns out that specific patch of dirt was holding a secret. That overgrown horse ranch happened to sit directly on top of the largest untapped lithium deposit and tech development zoning grid in the entire state of Georgia. The silence shattered. A low rumble of absolute shock rolled through the elite crowd as the realization hit them. The real estate brokers in the front row exchanged wild, disbelieving glances. "I just sold it," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute triumphant power. "I sold it for $200 million. The silence in the ballroom shattered into a million pieces. A deafening roar of applause erupted from the floor. It started with a few prominent investors in the front row and rapidly cascaded through the entire room until hundreds of Atlanta's most ruthless power brokers were giving me a standing ovation. These apex predators of capitalism, who had ignored my very existence 20 minutes ago, were now cheering for me as if I were a conquering hero. I raised a single hand signaling for quiet, but the frenzied energy in the room only grew stronger. Down on the floor, the physical reality of my announcement was tearing my biological family apart. The high society elite naturally and instinctually moved away from Winston and Beatrice, leaving them completely isolated in a wide circle of empty marble floor. They had suddenly become radioactive. Beatrice could not handle the isolation. The sight of $200 million slipping permanently out of her manicured grasp completely broke her fragile, superficial psyche. She shoved past a prominent city councilman, tearing the delicate hem of her rented Valentino gown in her frantic rush toward the stage. "That is my daughter!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a desperate, greedy hysteria that echoed horribly over the applause. "Let me through right now. We are her family. We raised her." She clawed her way toward the grand staircase, her eyes wild and manic. My security team moved with flawless, terrifying precision. Two massive agents stepped smoothly forward, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle at the base of the stairs. Beatrice slammed into them, her leased diamond necklace rattling against their chests, but they did not yield a single fraction of an inch. They stood like stone statues, easily blocking her frantic, grasping hands. Winston charged up right behind her, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were bulging as his illusion of control completely evaporated. "I am her father," Winston bellowed, pointing a shaking, arrogant finger directly at me. "I demand to be allowed up there. We are legally entitled to be part of this success." I stared down at them from the podium, the microphone perfectly capturing my cold, unwavering voice. "You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing, Winston," I said, my voice slicing through the remaining applause and plunging the room back into a stunned, dead silence. "Family is a sacred title earned through sacrifice and unconditional loyalty. You permanently forfeited that title the night you handed me a garbage bag and locked a grieving widow out in the freezing rain." The entire ballroom collectively cringed at my absolute public dismissal of the sterling patriarch. I watched the final shreds of Winston's reputation dissolve in real time. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. He was a defeated, broken man. I turned my back on them, dismissing their existence entirely. I shifted my attention back to the coat check area, where Pastor James and Sarah were standing perfectly still. Tears were streaming freely down Sarah's cheeks, ruining her simple makeup. James looked utterly overwhelmed, his deeply humble nature clashing wildly with the immense, terrifying wealth surrounding him. "Pastor James, Sarah." I called out, my tone softening, instantly replacing the Arctic ice with genuine warmth. "Please join me on the stage." The wealthy crowd parted for them immediately. The elite guests who had mocked them earlier now treated this modest couple with absolute reverence, stepping back respectfully to give them a wide, clear path. David, my head of security, personally walked down the stairs to escort them up the marble steps. They reached the stage looking completely breathless, standing awkwardly under the brilliant white spotlight. I looked at the two beautiful people who had literally saved my life. I nodded to David. He stepped forward and smoothly produced a heavy, thick, embossed golden portfolio from inside his tailored jacket. I took it in both hands, feeling the tremendous weight of the documents inside. I turned to James and held it out to him. When my own blood threw me away, you became my family, I said, my voice wavering slightly with genuine emotion. You risked your home, your retirement, and your entire future to give my twins a safe place to sleep. You took a massive risk on a broken woman without ever asking for a return on your investment. You only asked that I stand back up. Now it is my turn to invest in your future. James took the golden portfolio with visibly shaking hands, looking down at the custom embossed Caldwell crest on the cover. Inside that folder is the legal documentation for an irrevocable generational wealth trust, I announced, making sure every single broker and banker in the room heard the exact financial specifics. It is fully funded with $50 million strictly in the Caldwell name. Your children and your grandchildren will never know a single day of financial struggle ever again. Sarah let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as her knees actually buckled. James caught her swiftly, wrapping his arm tightly around her waist to keep her upright. He was weeping openly now, staring at the golden folder as if it were a miracle. There is more, I said, reaching under the podium to retrieve a thick-bound stack of architectural blueprints. I held them up high for the entire crowd to see. These are the fully funded blueprints for the brand new Caldwell Community Center. The commercial land has already been purchased. The contractors have been paid in full in cash. Construction begins on Monday morning. Your congregation will never face the threat of foreclosure or wealthy intimidation ever again. Flashbulbs suddenly erupted from the back of the ballroom in a blinding, brilliant strobe effect. The local media had breached the lobby, snapping frantic photographs of the newly revealed billionaire philanthropist and the humble pastor she had just elevated to the highest ranks of society. The applause started again, a thunderous rolling wave of total validation. I stood at the edge of the stage, letting the brilliant flashes wash over me, feeling the absolute intoxicating rush of victory. I looked down through the sea of cheering investors and locked eyes directly with Bradley. I was standing completely alone, abandoned by Chloe, sweating profusely as he watched me systematically dismantle his entire world. He knew I now possessed the unlimited capital to fund an army of lawyers to ensure his upcoming wire fraud trial ended in a maximum prison sentence. I smiled, a slow, dangerous, predatory curve of my lips. I did not need the microphone for this final message. I looked dead into his terrified, panicked eyes and clearly mouthed two words: "You're next." The flashbulbs continued to burst in a chaotic, blinding frenzy of white light as I turned my back on the ballroom floor, leaving Bradley paralyzed in the wake of my silent threat. David stepped immediately to my right side, shielding me from the grasping hands of desperate reporters and frantic real estate brokers. We moved quickly down the carpeted steps behind the main stage, leaving the roaring standing ovation behind us. The heavy acoustic doors of the backstage corridor swung shut, severing the deafening noise of the gala and plunging us into a thick, insulated quiet. I needed a moment to breathe. I directed my security detail to lock down the perimeter of the private VIP suite located at the end of the hall. The room smelled of expensive polished leather and fresh white lilies. I walked straight over to the mahogany wet bar, resting my hands on the cool marble counter. I reached for a crystal tumbler and a bottle of sparkling water. Before my hand even touched the glass, the heavy oak doors of the suite violently burst open. David stepped immediately into the doorframe, his hand dropping casually, but with lethal intent toward his holstered weapon. He blocked the entryway completely, a towering wall of uncompromising authority. They utilized the biological parent override protocol with hotel management, ma'am. David stated, his voice a flat, emotionless baritone. They caused a massive hostile scene at the security checkpoint, claiming a severe family medical emergency. Do you want them forcibly removed? I looked past David's broad shoulder. Winston, Beatrice, Chloe, and Bradley were shoved tightly together in the hallway, looking like a pack of cornered feral animals. Their expensive rented clothes were rumpled. Their eyes were wide with a sickening mixture of frantic panic and rabid, unapologetic greed. The mask of high society elegance they had worn for decades had completely melted away, leaving nothing but raw, desperate entitlement. "Let them in, David," I said calmly, picking up the crystal glass. "And close the door." The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the aggressive posturing began. Winston stormed toward the center of the room, his chest heaving. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face, attempting to summon the tyrannical patriarch persona that used to terrify me as a child. "You manipulative, ungrateful little brat!" Winston spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You set us up. You planned this entire public spectacle to intentionally humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of the entire city." "I simply told the truth, Winston," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. I twisted the cap off the sparkling water. The gentle fizzing sound filled the tense, heavy air. "If the truth humiliates you, that is a direct reflection of your terrible character." Beatrice pushed past her husband, tears already streaming down her perfectly contoured face. It was her signature move, playing the wounded, devastated victim whenever she was held accountable for her own cruelty. "How could you do this to your own mother?" Beatrice sobbed, clutching her chest dramatically. "We gave you life. We raised you in absolute luxury. And you stand on a stage and drag our family legacy through the mud. You are destroying us." "Your legacy was ruined the moment you decided your social status was more important than your own child," I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water. Winston stepped aggressively in front of his wife, his eyes gleaming with a sudden manic calculation. The humiliation was already fading, replaced entirely by the intoxicating math he was doing in his head. $200 million. It was more than enough to save his collapsing empire. "Enough of this emotional nonsense!" Winston barked, his voice dropping into the harsh, commanding tone he used to bully his corporate subordinates. "We are family, and family shares the wealth. You secured a $200 million windfall tonight. I demand our cut." I lowered my glass, resting it gently on the marble counter. I looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Your cut, 50%, Winston stated, entirely serious. He actually puffed out his chest, trying to project a legal authority he did not possess. $100 million transferred into my primary holding account by tomorrow morning. I paid for your elite private high school, Maya. I fed you. I clothed you. I provided the foundational education that allowed you to negotiate a real estate deal of this magnitude. You owe me that money. It is a completely fair return on my initial investment." Bradley nodded eagerly from the back of the room, nervously adjusting his collar. "He is right, Maya. We are your family. You owe us a bailout." I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or throw my glass. I simply stared at them until the silence in the room became so heavy and suffocating they began to shift uncomfortably on their feet. I walked slowly around the edge of the bar, moving toward the center coffee table. "An initial investment." I repeated the words, tasting like poison in my mouth. "Let us talk about investments, Winston. Let us talk about Marcus." Beatrice flinched, physically backing away toward the door. 4 years ago, Marcus needed a highly specialized experimental surgery. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. It cost exactly $400,000. The insurance company denied the claim. We had exhausted our savings paying for his previous treatments. I came to your house, Winston. I sat in your immaculate formal living room and I begged you for a loan. I offered to sign a predatory contract. I offered to work for your manufacturing company for free for the rest of my life. I dropped to my knees and begged you to save the father of your grandchildren. Winston avoided my gaze, staring hard at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. Business was tight, Maya. We had liquidity issues. We could not just hand over almost $500,000 for a long-shot medical procedure. It did not make financial sense. Yao bought Chloe a brand new imported Bentley. The very next week, I countered the icy precision of my words, cutting through his pathetic excuse like a scalpel. You spent $80,000 catering a summer garden party for your country club friends. You had the money. You simply decided that Marcus was not worth saving. You looked at my dying husband and you ran a cold cost-benefit analysis. You decided he was a bad investment. That is not fair, Chloe whined, stepping out from behind Bradley. We did not know he was going to die so fast. I shot her a look so lethal she instantly clamped her mouth shut and shrank back against the wall. You watched him die, I stated, turning my relentless focus back to my parents. You watched me bury him. You threw me out into the rain with 2 babies because my poverty embarrassed you. You told me I was dead to you. I took a step closer, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. And now you stand in my private suite demanding $100 million because you paid my high school tuition. Winston clenched his jaw, his absolute desperation overriding any lingering sense of shame. You have more money than you could ever possibly spend, Maya. You can save us right now. I am on the verge of total foreclosure. The banks are seizing everything. I know exactly what the banks are doing, Winston, I said softly. I reached down to the glass coffee table where a thick, heavy black binder was resting. I picked it up and slid it smoothly across the polished glass surface until it bumped gently against Winston's legs. He looked down at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. I did not just sell land today, I explained, my voice completely devoid of mercy. I bought assets. Winston slowly bent down and picked up the black binder. His hands were violently shaking as he flipped open the heavy leather cover. I bought up every single piece of your distressed debt, I said, watching his eyes scan the dense legal documents inside. I bought the commercial mortgages on your office buildings. I purchased the primary notes on your residential estates. I quietly acquired every single outstanding share of your company that your panicked investors were dumping on the open market. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrific gasp, clutching Bradley's arm for support. Open it, Dad, I commanded softly. Look at the signature lines. Look at who owns the controlling shares of your manufacturing company as of exactly 4 o'clock today. Winston stood frozen, his eyes scanning the heavy leather cover of the binder, his mind failing to process the reality of his utter ruin. But Bradley did not freeze. Bradley reacted with the frantic, violent panic of a cornered animal. He snatched the thick black binder directly out of my father's trembling hands. His eyes darted wildly across the crisp legal text, jumping from the acquisition clauses to the transfer of equity agreements. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray, the exact shade of wet cement. He dropped the binder onto the glass coffee table with a loud smack. He grabbed the edges of his expensive tailored suit jacket, his chest heaving as he began to hyperventilate. The polished, untouchable Wall Street arrogance that had defined his entire personality for the past decade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He backed away from the table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This is a forgery, Bradley stammered, his voice climbing an octave. This is an absolute fabrication. You do not have the liquidity to acquire Sterling Manufacturing. You do not have the capital to buy out my firm's commercial debt. You are a charity case. You are a welfare project that stumbled into a gold mine. I remained perfectly still, watching him unravel. I have the receipts, Bradley. Every single transaction was routed through offshore holding companies and finalized by the top corporate attorneys in this city. I own the debt. I own the company. I own you. The reality of his situation finally breached his denial, and the polished veneer of the Ivy League savior completely burned away, leaving nothing but ugly, raw bigotry. He stepped toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. You think you can play in the big leagues? Bradley screamed, spittle flying from his lips. You are nothing but a desperate, uneducated black single mother who got lucky with a patch of worthless dirt. You do not understand macroeconomics. You do not belong in the same boardroom as me. I have degrees from Wharton. I manage portfolios that are worth more than your entire pathetic life. You are a fluke, a statistical anomaly. You cannot outsmart a financial model built by actual professionals. Chloe grabbed his arm, terrified by his sudden violent outburst. Bradley, stop, she pleaded, her voice trembling. You are making it worse. He violently shoved her hand away, his eyes completely bloodshot and manic. Shut up, Chloe. I am not going to stand here and let some charity case from the wrong side of the tracks dictate the terms of my career. I am a senior vice president. I am a titan in this industry. She is just a glorified squatter who hit the lottery. She does not know how to manage real power. I let him scream. I let him expose the toxic, fragile entitlement that had always fueled his hatred of me. When he finally stopped gasping for air, the room was suffocatingly quiet. Even Winston and Beatrice looked horrified by the vile, racist vitriol spewing from their prize son-in-law. They had always masked their prejudice with Southern manners and corporate speak, but Bradley had just laid it entirely bare. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. I swallowed, enjoying the absolute terrifying silence. "You are right about one thing, Bradley," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "I do not have a degree from Wharton. I did not spend 4 years learning how to build theoretical financial models in a pristine ivory tower. I spent my time learning how to survive. I learned how to track every single penny, how to spot an unstable foundation, and how to identify a desperate man drowning in his own greed." I took a step toward him, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "I did not just stumble into a $200 million land sale, Bradley. That was merely the final stage of my strategy. Long before I sold that tech zoning grid, I was quietly flipping smaller commercial lots in the valley. I was generating massive, untraceable liquidity. And while you were busy lecturing me about your superior intellect at family dinners, I was using that liquidity to hire the best forensic accountants in the state." Bradley's breathing hitched. He took a tiny step backward, the anger instantly evaporating into sheer terror. "They looked deep into your firm's supposedly bulletproof portfolios," I continued, my voice echoing off the cold walls of the VIP suite. "They found the massive gaping holes in your commercial real estate funds. They found the toxic debt you had been desperately hiding from your senior partners. Your firm was bleeding capital, and you were the one holding the knife. You were illegally shifting client assets to cover your massive personal losses. So I created a series of anonymous shell companies. And over the last 8 months, I systematically bought up every single piece of that toxic debt." Bradley shook his head, his hands trembling violently. "No, no, that is impossible. You could not have bypassed the regulatory checks. You could not have acquired those margins without triggering an internal audit." I smiled, a sharp, predatory curve of my lips. "I bought the debt for pennies on the dollar because your firm was desperate to offload it before the quarterly reviews. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, so convinced of your intellectual superiority, that you never even bothered to look at who was actually buying the paper. You handed me the leash to your entire professional life, and you actually thanked the invisible buyer for taking the garbage off your desk." I walked around the coffee table, closing the distance between us, until I was standing inches from his face. I could smell the stale champagne and sheer panic radiating off his skin. "I own the commercial mortgages on your firm's primary headquarters," I whispered softly, ensuring every single word struck like a physical blow. "I control the debt on your personal estate. I hold the power to completely liquidate your entire career with a single phone call to my wealth managers. I can strip you of your title, your assets, and your untouchable Wall Street reputation before the sun comes up tomorrow morning." Chloe let out a pathetic, strangled sob, sinking onto the plush leather sofa as the devastating reality crushed the last of her delusions. Winston and Beatrice stood perfectly still, realizing they had aligned themselves with a man who was just as financially doomed as they were. Their golden ticket was nothing but a mirage. Bradley looked like he was going to collapse. His eyes darted toward the door, searching for an escape that did not exist. "You cannot do this," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You cannot destroy me. I will lose everything, my licenses, my freedom. Please, Maya, we can make a deal. I can restructure the debt. I can get you a massive return on your investment. I can fix this." I tilted my head, studying the complete destruction of the man who had mocked my grief and insulted my intelligence. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt the absolute cold satisfaction of perfect justice. "You always said I didn't understand finance, Bradley." I smiled coldly. "So I guess you won't mind that I handed your embezzlement records over to the SEC this morning." The words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered with a beautiful smile. Bradley staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy, blunt object. His knees buckled instantly, and he collapsed onto the edge of the plush leather sofa. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic sound that was half sob and half gasp. The Ivy League titan, the untouchable financial genius who had mocked my poverty at every holiday dinner, was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified, broken criminal, waiting for federal agents to knock on his front door. He knew exactly what the SEC did to embezzlers who stole from high net worth clients. His life was effectively over. Chloe stared at her husband. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a freight train. Her eyes darted around the room, processing the sheer magnitude of the devastation. The offshore accounts were frozen. The leased Bentley would be repossessed. The Hampton summer house would be seized by the government. The millions of dollars she thought secured her elite social status were evaporating into thin air right in front of her eyes. She looked at Bradley weeping on the sofa. Then she looked at me standing calmly by the mahogany bar, her survival instincts kicked into maximum overdrive. She did what a parasite always does when its host begins to die. She immediately looked for a new one. "I didn't know," Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls of the VIP suite. She took a massive, deliberate step away from Bradley, as if his sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. She pointed an accusing finger at the man she had sworn to love. "I swear to God, Maya, I had absolutely no idea what he was doing," Chloe yelled, her voice rising in frantic panic. "He lied to me. He hid the bank statements. He is a fraud and a thief, and I am a victim here. I thought he was a legitimate broker. I would never associate with a criminal." Bradley snapped his head up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with absolute betrayal. "Chloe, you spent half of that stolen money." He choked out, his voice cracking. "You knew exactly where it was coming from when you bought those diamond tennis bracelets last month." She ignored him completely. The facade of the perfect wealthy power couple was dead. Chloe rushed toward me. Before David could even step forward to intercept her, she threw herself violently onto the carpeted floor. She fell hard onto her knees, her manicured hands desperately grabbing the silk fabric of my skirt. "Maya, please," she wailed, tears smearing her expensive designer mascara and running down her cheeks. "You have to help me. I am your sister. We grew up together. We shared a bedroom. We share the same blood. You cannot leave me tied to this sinking ship. I will divorce him right now. I will call my lawyers and sign the papers tomorrow morning. I will testify against him in federal court if that is what you want." She looked up at me, her face a twisted mask of pathetic, utter desperation. The golden child who had spent her entire life looking down her nose at my struggles was now groveling at my feet like a beggar. "Just give me a job," Chloe begged, pulling frantically at my dress. "A consulting role at your new tech company. Or just a small allowance to keep me on my feet until the divorce goes through." $1 million is nothing to you now, Maya. It is pocket change. You just made $200 million. Please, you are a good person. You have a good heart. You are my big sister." Winston and Beatrice watched the grotesque scene in absolute horrified silence. Their perfect daughter, the one they had always held up as the shining example of family success, was weeping on the floor, willing to sell her husband out to avoid losing her country club membership. The sterling family pride was completely annihilated. I looked down at Chloe. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt the absolute zero temperature of total detachment. I reached into my clutch and slowly pulled out my phone. "You want to talk about blood, Chloe?" I said smoothly, my voice cutting through her frantic sobbing. "You want to talk about family loyalty and being a good sister?" I tapped the glowing screen, navigating to a hidden folder of saved audio files. I had kept this specific voicemail for 3 long, painful years, holding on to it, waiting for the perfect moment of absolute clarity. I turned the volume on my phone all the way to maximum and pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. It was Chloe's voice, slurred heavily with too much expensive champagne, laughing uproariously over the thumping bass of a country club party. "Oh my God, no!" The recorded version of Chloe laughed, her tone dripping with vicious, cruel mockery. "I am absolutely not inviting Maya to the Hamptons this weekend. Are you insane? She is completely broke. She would probably show up in thrift store clothes and expect us to pay for her dinner. Plus, I cannot have her bringing those ghetto charity cases she calls children around my friends. They are a complete embarrassment to the family image." The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents above us. Chloe's face went perfectly pale. She let go of my dress instantly, as if the silk fabric had suddenly caught fire. She scrambled backward on the floor, her eyes wide with total shock and consuming shame. She looked at our parents, but Winston and Beatrice turned their heads, unable to defend the sheer, undeniable cruelty of her own words. "That was a long time ago," Chloe stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably as she pressed her back against the base of the sofa. "I was drinking, Maya. I did not mean it. I was just trying to fit in with Bradley's wealthy friends. I love your twins. You called my children ghetto charity cases," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal, uncompromising finality. "You mocked their very existence while their father was cold in the ground. You used my tragedy as a punchline for your wealthy friends." I took a slow, deliberate step back, physically and permanently, removing myself from her reach. I looked at the pathetic, weeping woman on the floor and felt nothing but the pure, clean satisfaction of absolute justice. "You don't have a sister, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "And as of tomorrow, you won't have a house either. Check your email." "You don't have a sister, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "And as of tomorrow, you won't have a house either. Check your email." Chloe scrambled for her phone with violently trembling hands, her manicured nails slipping against the screen. The device illuminated her tear-streaked face as she opened her private inbox. I watched the exact second her reality fractured. The color drained completely from her cheeks, leaving a sickly, translucent pallor. She dropped the phone onto the carpet as if the metal burned her flesh. The eviction notices, the asset seizure documents, the immediate freezing of her offshore trust accounts. They were all legally filed, stamped, and irreversibly binding. She let out a hollow, devastated wail, burying her face in the expensive leather sofa cushions, mourning the only thing she had ever truly loved, her money. Beatrice watched her golden child completely collapse. She watched Bradley staring blankly at the wall, his entire corporate career and impending freedom entirely eradicated. She looked at Winston, who was still gripping the black binder of his own monumental financial ruin. The immaculate Sterling dynasty was completely dead. The realization flickered across Beatrice's perfectly preserved face, but it did not manifest as despair. It manifested as pure predatory survival. She had navigated the treacherous waters of Atlanta high society for 4 decades by knowing exactly when to pivot and who to manipulate. She saw that Winston was useless. She saw that Bradley was a liability. She realized instantly that the only power left in the room belonged to the daughter she had thrown away. Beatrice stepped directly over Chloe's weeping form, not even glancing down to comfort her favorite child. She adjusted her posture, smoothing the front of her expensive silk gown with steady hands. She took a deep breath and summoned her, with the practiced, flawless ease of a seasoned sociopath. Her eyes glistened with a sudden, overwhelming display of maternal warmth that made the air in the room feel physically toxic. She walked toward me, her arms outstretched, an expression of profound, overwhelming pride painted across her features. "Maya, my beautiful, brilliant girl," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a masterful pitch of manufactured emotion. I did not move. I let her approach, letting her step directly into my personal space. The heavy scent of her exclusive Chanel perfume washed over me, instantly triggering a visceral, sickening flash of the night she locked me out in the freezing rain. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, pressing her cheek against mine in a display of aggressive affection. I stood as rigid as a marble statue, feeling the sheer manipulative desperation radiating from her embrace. "Oh, my sweet, brave girl," Beatrice murmured intensely, her grip tightening as she tried to force a physical connection. "You have no idea how hard it was for me to watch you struggle. You have no idea how much it broke a mother's heart to turn you away that night. But look at you now. Look at the absolute titan you have become." She pulled back just enough to look directly into my eyes, her hands gripping my arms with a frantic, desperate strength. She was attempting to rewrite history right in front of me. "I knew you had this incredible fire inside you," Maya Beatrice pleaded, her voice thick with desperate theatrical conviction. "I always knew you were the strongest of us all. If I had simply handed you a check, you never would have found this immense power. You would have settled for a mediocre life. You never would have discovered your true, unlimited potential. I had to be tough. I had to push you to the absolute brink so you would finally learn how to fight the world on your own terms. I did this to build your character." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was almost a dark masterpiece. She was actually attempting to take direct credit for the multi-million-dollar empire I built out of the ashes she deliberately created. She was trying to reframe her sociopathic cruelty as a complex, painful sacrifice of maternal love. It was the ultimate emotional manipulation, a frantic bid to tether herself to my newfound wealth and power. She thought I was still the broken little girl desperate for a mother's approval. I stared into her perfectly manicured face. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked at her with a void of empathy so vast and arctic, it caused her fake smile to slowly falter. The maternal warmth in her eyes short-circuited as she realized her psychological warfare was completely useless. I reached my hand down and smoothly opened the golden clasp of my evening clutch. I bypassed the sleek platinum credit cards and the heavy metallic keys to my new private estate. My fingers found a small folded piece of paper hidden deliberately in the deepest zippered pocket. I pulled it out. It was a faded, severely crumpled medical invoice. The edges were worn soft from the hundreds of times I had held it, cried over it, and used it as raw fuel during my darkest, longest nights. I held the folded paper up between us, breaking her physical embrace. "Do you remember what this is, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice a flat, dead calm. She blinked, staring at the faded hospital logo at the top of the page. A sudden creeping dread replaced her theatrical performance. She tried to take a step back, but I mirrored her movement, keeping the paper directly in her line of sight. "This is the emergency deposit invoice from Atlanta General Hospital," I explained, holding the paper mere inches from her face. Marcus's lungs were failing rapidly. The doctors needed to perform an immediate emergency bypass procedure just to stabilize him for the larger surgery. The hospital administration required a baseline financial deposit before they would wheel him into the operating theater. It was not $400,000. It was a fraction of the total cost. It was exactly $12,450. Beatrice swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Maya, please," she whispered, her voice losing its manufactured strength entirely. "That is in the past. We have to look at the future now. We are a family." I stepped forward, matching her retreat, ensuring she could not escape the ghosts of her own unforgivable actions. "I came to your back door because Winston had already thrown me out the front." I continued, the memory playing out in the room with vivid, razor-sharp clarity. "I knocked on the kitchen window until my knuckles bled. You opened the door in your silk robe holding a glass of wine. I showed you this exact piece of paper. I told you that $12,450 would keep my husband breathing until morning. I told you I would clean your floors. I told you I would disappear from your high society life forever if you just gave me the deposit." I watched the color drain from Beatrice's face. The reality of that night, the undeniable truth of her monstrous behavior, stripped away her false maternal narrative, leaving her completely exposed. "You looked at the invoice, Beatrice," I said softly, closing the distance until I could whisper directly into her ear. "You looked at the price of my husband's life, and you told me that I was ruining your quiet evening. You told me that failure has a price, and I needed to pay it. You closed the door, and you locked the deadbolt while I screamed for mercy on your patio." I stepped back, looking at the woman who brought me into the world. She was trembling violently now, the fake tears entirely replaced by genuine, paralyzing terror. She knew there was no manipulation left to deploy. She knew I had kept the receipts of her cruelty for 4 brutal, devastating years. I flattened the crumpled paper against my palm. I reached forward and firmly pressed the faded invoice directly against Beatrice's chest, forcing her to take it. Her shaking fingers instinctively curled around the edges of the paper. "You refused me $12,450 to save my husband's life," I said, my voice carrying the lethal finality of an executioner. "Now that is exactly what I am leaving you to live on. Not a penny more." Beatrice stared at the faded piece of paper pressed against her chest. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as they grazed the ink. The invoice felt heavier than a block of solid lead. She looked up at me, Her lips parted in a silent scream of absolute defeat. The matriarch of the Sterling Empire finally realized that her manipulative tears were completely useless against a woman who had already survived the worst pain imaginable. Before Beatrice could attempt another pathetic plea, the heavy mahogany double doors of the VIP suite swung open with a sharp, authoritative crack. 4 men walked into the room. They did not wear the flashy tailored suits of Wall Street gamblers like Bradley. They wore the stark, uncompromising charcoal gray of high-level corporate litigators. These were the executioners of the financial world, the men who dismantled dynasties and liquidated legacies without a shred of emotion. My lead corporate counsel, Harrison, stood at the front of the pack holding a thick manila envelope sealed with a red legal tag. Harrison did not offer a polite greeting. He did not introduce himself to my parents. He walked directly past the weeping forms of Chloe and Beatrice, his leather shoes silent against the plush carpet. He stopped squarely in front of Winston. Winston looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He was still clutching the black binder of his ruined company, his knuckles stark white. "Mr. Winston Sterling Harrison," said his voice carrying the cold mechanical precision of a surgical scalpel, "you have been officially served." Harrison thrust the thick manila envelope into Winston's chest, forcing him to drop the black binder to take it. Winston fumbled with the clasp, his breathing ragged and uneven. He pulled out the stack of heavily watermarked legal documents. His eyes darted to the bold black lettering at the top of the first page. I watched the exact moment Winston's heart stopped. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean his weight against the edge of the glass coffee table to keep from collapsing. "This is impossible!" Winston gasped, his voice a high-pitched wheeze. "This is a private commercial loan. This was a confidential bridge note from Vanguard Trust." I stepped forward, placing myself right beside Harrison. Vanguard Trust is a subsidiary of a holding firm registered in the Cayman Islands. "Winston," I said, my tone perfectly level, "and that holding firm is entirely owned by me." Winston shook his head violently, denying the mathematical reality staring him in the face. "You could not have known about this," he stammered. "Nobody knew about this leverage, not even Beatrice." Beatrice's head snapped up at the sound of her name. "Winston, what did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden raw panic. "What did you do to our house?" "I will tell you exactly what he did. Beatrice," I said, never taking my eyes off my father, "18 months ago, your prized son-in-law Bradley began hemorrhaging cash. He was bleeding your family company dry to cover his toxic commercial real estate bets. Sterling Manufacturing was facing a massive liquidity crisis." Winston panicked. He knew if he went to a traditional bank, they would audit the company and discover Bradley's embezzlement. So Winston sought out a private shadow loan to quietly inject cash into the business to keep it afloat. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to Winston, forcing him to look at me. "To secure that massive shadow loan, Winston used the only unencumbered asset the Sterling family had left." I continued, my voice ringing through the silent room. "He leveraged the ancestral mansion. He put up the deed to your pristine country club estate as collateral. He signed away the physical foundation of your precious high society image to save a fraudulent company." Beatrice let out a sound like a wounded animal. She slumped against the wall, clutching her chest as the full weight of her husband's secret betrayal crushed her. The mansion was her kingdom. It was the stage where she hosted her elite galas and maintained her illusion of absolute superiority. Without it, she was nothing. "You bought the paper," Winston choked out, staring at the documents in his hands as if they were covered in poison. "You bought the debt on your own childhood home." "I did not buy it for sentimental reasons, Winston," I replied coldly. "I bought it because the default clauses were incredibly aggressive, clauses that you signed willingly because you were too arrogant to believe you would ever miss a payment." Harrison stepped forward seamlessly, picking up the execution. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling Harrison," announced, his voice booming with legal authority, "your commercial bridge loan has been in arrears for 90 days. As of this morning, the grace period has officially expired. Your property is in immediate default. All equity is hereby forfeited to the primary lien holder. You have until Monday at 8 in the morning to completely vacate the premises." The words struck the room like a series of detonation charges. Monday, Chloe screamed from the floor. That is 3 days! Where are we supposed to go? Harrison ignored her, entirely focusing his cold gaze on Winston. If you or any members of your family remain on the property past 8 o'clock Monday morning, you will be forcibly removed by the county sheriff for criminal trespassing. Furthermore, any attempt to strip the house of fixtures, art, or valuable assets will be prosecuted as theft. The property and everything inside it belongs to my client. The total absolute destruction of the Sterling dynasty was complete. They had no money, they had no company, they had no home. The elite society they had worshipped and sacrificed me to would shun them. The second the news hit the financial papers tomorrow morning, they were entirely ruined. Winston snapped. The crushing reality of losing his empire, his mansion and his pride broke the last fragile remaining tether of his sanity. The polished Southern gentleman, the calculating patriarch, vanished completely. He looked at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. "You ungrateful, vicious little," Winston roared, his voice tearing through his throat. "I gave you life. I built this family. You will not take my home from me." He dropped the legal papers and lunged directly at me, his hands forming tight, violent fists. He crossed the space between us with terrifying speed, his eyes wide and completely feral. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. Before Winston could even bring his hands within a foot of my face, a massive shadow blurred past me. The two private security contractors I had stationed directly outside the VIP doors moved with lethal, terrifying efficiency. The lead guard, a man built like a concrete vault, slammed his forearm directly into Winston's chest, stopping his violent momentum instantly. The impact forced a loud, sickening gasp from my father's lungs. Before Winston could recover, the second guard grabbed his arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and drove him face first into the thick mahogany wall. The sound of Winston's face hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. Dad, Chloe shrieked, scrambling backward on the floor. Beatrice covered her mouth, screaming hysterically as she watched her husband pinned helplessly against the paneling. Winston struggled, kicking and cursing, but the security guards held him completely immobilized. He looked like a pathetic, captured animal thrashing against a steel cage he could never break. I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had cast me out into the cold, watching him reduced to a powerless, raging prisoner in a room he used to own. "Keep him pinned until I am in the elevator," I instructed the security team, my voice calm and completely detached. "Then let him go. If he follows me, have him arrested for assault." "Understood, ma'am," the lead guard replied easily, holding Winston's thrashing weight against the wall. I turned away from this gruesome, pathetic scene. I did not look at Chloe weeping on the floor. I did not look at Beatrice clutching her chest in shock. I did not look at Bradley shivering on the sofa waiting for federal prison. I adjusted the strap of my designer bag on my shoulder. I walked toward the open double doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor of the hallway. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of my father's screaming. I looked straight ahead, perfectly silent, and never looked back. The Sunday morning sun rose over Atlanta, illuminating a city that was already feasting on the spectacular carcass of the Sterling family legacy. The news did not just leak, it detonated. Every major newspaper in the state ran the story on the front page. Elite financial blogs and high society gossip columns were saturated with the catastrophic details of Bradley's embezzlement, Winston's fraudulent leverage, and the impending federal indictments. The sheer magnitude of their financial ruin and moral bankruptcy was the only thing anyone in Buckhead was talking about over their morning coffee. Inside the heavily mortgaged mansion, they had mere hours left to vacate. Winston and Beatrice were engaged in a masterclass of psychotic denial. They moved through the echoing hallways like perfectly dressed ghosts. Beatrice spent 2 hours having her hair and makeup done, meticulously applying layers of expensive foundation to hide the gray, sickly pallor of her skin. She draped herself in her finest designer suit, clutching her diamond rosary as if it were a magical talisman against poverty. Winston forced himself into a tailored charcoal suit, ignoring the violent trembling in his hands as he fastened his gold cufflinks. They were going to church. Not just any church, but the First Cathedral of Atlanta, the glittering epicenter of the city's wealthy elite. It was a megachurch where millionaires went to network and absolve their corporate sins. Winston and Beatrice convinced themselves that if they just showed up, projected absolute confidence, and smiled through the service, they could control the narrative. They believed their 4 decades of social dominance would insulate them from the scandal. They truly believed they could charm their way out of federal investigations and bankruptcy. They were utterly, hopelessly wrong. Winston steered his leased Mercedes into the pristine private parking lot of the cathedral. The moment they stepped out of the vehicle, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The air grew freezing cold despite the humid Georgia morning. A group of women standing near the fountain who usually flocked to Beatrice to compliment her outfits immediately stopped talking. They turned their backs in unison, their eyes darting away as if making eye contact with Beatrice would infect them with poverty. Winston placed a rigid hand on the small of Beatrice's back, marching her toward the grand marble steps of the cathedral. He spotted Richard and Thomas, 2 senior board members from their exclusive country club, standing near the massive oak doors. Winston pasted on his signature booming charismatic smile and raised a hand in greeting. Morning. Richard. Winston called out, his voice carrying a desperate forced joviality. Beautiful Sunday, isn't it? Richard looked directly at Winston. There was no flicker of recognition, no polite nod. Richard simply turned his head, completely ignoring Winston's outstretched hand, and continued his conversation with Thomas, as if Winston were entirely invisible. The deliberate public snub hit Winston like a physical blow to the stomach. His hand dropped awkwardly to his side. Beatrice's breath hitched, her manicured fingers digging painfully into Winston's forearm. The social execution had begun. They forced themselves to keep walking, climbing the marble steps toward the sanctuary. The hushed whispers of the congregation rippled through the gathering crowd, following them like a toxic shadow. Words like federal prison and completely broke and pathetic fraud drifted into their ears from every direction. They were no longer the kings and queens of Atlanta. They were pariahs. They were a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. As they reached the massive arched entrance, their path was abruptly blocked. Elias, the head usher, and a man Winston had personally sponsored for church membership a decade ago, stepped directly into the center of the doorway. He was flanked by 2 large security attendants in sharp dark suits. Elias did not offer a Sunday bulletin. He did not offer a welcoming smile. He stood with his arms folded, his face set in a mask of stern, unyielding authority. "Good morning, Elias," Winston said, his voice tight, trying to push past the man. "Excuse us, we need to get to our usual pew." Elias did not move a single inch. "I am afraid I cannot let you inside, Winston," he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear perfectly. Beatrice gasped, her face flushing with hot, indignant rage. "Elias, how dare you speak to us this way?" she hissed, stepping forward. "We have been platinum tier members of this congregation for 30 years. We paid for the stained glass windows in the south wing. Move aside immediately." Elias looked at Beatrice with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the official gold-embossed seal of the church's Board of Elders. He held it out, extending it toward Winston. "This was drafted late last night after the news broke," Elias stated firmly. "The board held an emergency session. Your membership has been officially revoked, effective immediately." Winston stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He refused to take it. "What is the meaning of this?" Winston demanded, his voice shaking with humiliation, as dozens of elite churchgoers stopped to watch the spectacle. "You cannot banish us. We built this community." Elias simply dropped the envelope. It fluttered down, landing directly on the tips of Winston's polished leather shoes. "The board invokes the moral turpitude clause," Elias explained, projecting his voice over the murmuring crowd. "The cathedral cannot be associated with the financial scandals, the embezzlement, and the deliberate defrauding of innocent people. You are no longer welcome on these grounds. If you do not leave the premises right now, I will have security escort you off the property in front of everyone." Beatrice let out a strangled, humiliating cry, covering her face with her designer clutch. The women she used to rule, the men Winston used to command, they were all watching. Some were whispering, some were actively sneering, and some were pulling out their smartphones to record the fall of the Sterling Empire. The complete absolute social death they had spent their entire lives terrified of was happening in broad daylight on the steps of their own church. Winston looked at the faces of his former friends. He saw no mercy. He saw only the brutal, unforgiving reality of high society. When you lose your money, you lose your existence. He grabbed Beatrice's arm with bruising force and turned around. They practically ran down the marble steps, fleeing the whispers and the glaring eyes. They scrambled back into the Mercedes, slamming the doors shut to block out the stares of the congregation. The silence inside the car was deafening. Beatrice broke down into ugly, gasping sobs, her perfectly applied makeup running in dark, muddy streaks down her face. They had absolutely nothing. The banks had frozen their accounts. The lawyers were seizing their home tomorrow morning. Their friends had abandoned them. They were radioactive outcasts with no safe harbor left in the entire world. Winston gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles threatened to tear through his skin. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and manic. The polished veneer of the wealthy patriarch was entirely stripped away, leaving a desperate, cornered animal. He keyed the ignition, the engine roaring to life. He threw the car into drive, his eyes burning with a dark, unhinged desperation. "Where are we going?" Beatrice sobbed, clutching her ruined face. "We have nowhere to go." Winston stared blankly through the windshield, his jaw locked in a rigid, terrifying line. He gripped the gearshift, pulling the heavy vehicle out of the parking lot and accelerating recklessly onto the main highway. "We are going to the ranch," Winston growled, his voice barely recognizable. "We are going to see Maya." The torrential rain battered the windshield of the leased Mercedes as Winston drove erratically away from the city limits. The sky had turned a bruised, violent purple before opening up and dumping thick, heavy sheets of freezing water onto the highway. Winston gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his breath fogging the glass, his chest heaving with manic panic. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, completely mute, staring blankly into the apocalyptic storm. Her designer clothes were damp from the cold sweat of her own mounting terror. They had tried their platinum credit cards at a suburban gas station an hour ago. Every single transaction was violently declined. The federal investigators had already moved in. Every corporate account, every personal checking ledger, every hidden emergency fund had been completely frozen by the government. They had $3 in loose change sitting in the cup holder and a quarter tank of gas. They were entirely destitute. Winston finally swerved off the main highway, navigating blindly down a long, winding country road lined with massive ancient oak trees. The GPS led them deeper into the elite, isolated equestrian country just outside the city limits. The dark, dangerous road was illuminated by dual towering stone pillars flanking a massive set of wrought iron gates. The gates were absolutely imposing, easily 12 feet high, and capped with sharp, intimidating steel spikes. High-definition security cameras whirred mechanically, instantly tracking the movement of the Mercedes. This was Maya's ranch. It was a literal fortress. Winston threw the car into park, not even bothering to turn off the engine. He shoved his door open, stepping directly into a deep puddle of freezing mud. The torrential rain hit him instantly, soaking through his custom charcoal suit in seconds. Beatrice followed him, shivering violently as the icy downpour plastered her ruined silk gown to her frail, shivering frame. Winston stumbled toward the stone pillar, searching frantically for the intercom panel. He slammed his palm against the glowing silver button. "Maya," he screamed over the deafening roar of the rain. "Maya, open the gate. Please." Silence answered him. He hit the button again, his hand slipping on the wet metal. "Maya, we know you are in there." The bank locked the doors to the mansion. "We cannot get back inside. The credit cards are dead. We have nowhere to go. Open the damn gates." Beatrice pushed her way to the speaker, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "Maya, please, it is your mother," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully. "We are freezing. We have no money. Please let us inside. Just for tonight. We will sleep in the barn. We just need to get out of the storm." A harsh mechanical click echoed from the speaker, followed by dead silence. Then the massive floodlights mounted on the stone pillars flared to life simultaneously. The blinding white light cut through the sheet of rain, illuminating the sprawling property beyond the iron bars. Through the heavy downpour, Winston and Beatrice saw the long, sweeping paved driveway that led up a gentle hill toward a massive modern estate glowing warmly in the distance. And walking slowly down the center of that driveway was Maya. She was not running. She was not hurrying. She walked with a slow, measured, terrifyingly calm, deliberate pace. She held a large black umbrella over her head, her dark trench coat perfectly dry, shielding her entirely from the violent storm. Flanking her on either side were the exact same two massive security guards from the hotel suite. They walked in perfect sync with her, their dark raincoats deflecting the weather. Their eyes locked onto Winston and Beatrice with cold professional menace. Winston gripped the thick wet iron bars of the gate, his knuckles turning stark white. He pressed his face against the cold metal, looking exactly like a desperate prisoner begging a warden for mercy. Maya, thank God, Winston gasped, spitting out rainwater as she stopped on the other side of the gate. Please open it. We are soaking wet. We are freezing to death out here. Maya stood perfectly still, exactly 3 feet away from the iron barrier. She looked at Winston shivering in the mud, his expensive shoes ruined, his silver hair plastered to his skull. She looked at Beatrice weeping uncontrollably, hugging her own arms for warmth, her extravagant diamond jewelry mocking her newfound homelessness. I did not invite you to my home, Winston, Maya said, her voice carrying clearly over the storm, smooth and completely devoid of empathy. You are trespassing. Winston shook the iron bars frantically. Maya, please, you have to listen to me. Bradley destroyed everything. The company is gone. The house is gone. We have absolutely nothing left. We drove all the way out here because we have no one else. We are your family. We are your blood. You can't let us sleep in the street. Beatrice reached her hand through the wide iron bars, grasping desperately toward the empty air. Maya, please, I am begging you, Beatrice cried, her voice pathetic and ragged. I am your mother. Look at me. I am freezing. Just give us one of the guest houses. You have hundreds of acres here. We will stay out of your way. We will not bother you. Just give us a roof over our heads. You cannot be this cruel. Maya watched her mother's hand shaking in the freezing rain. She did not step forward to take it. She did not offer the umbrella. She simply stood under the protective canopy of black silk, watching the two people who had gleefully thrown her to the wolves beg for a single scrap of human decency. You talk about cruelty. Beatrice, Maya stated, her tone conversational and entirely detached. You talk about family and blood. Where was that blood connection when Marcus was dying in a hospital bed? Where was that family loyalty when you locked your doors and let me scream in the rain holding a sick baby? Winston's shoulders slumped. He pressed his forehead against the cold iron, totally broken. We made a mistake, Maya, he whispered, his arrogance completely extinguished. We made a horrible, terrible mistake. But we are paying for it now. We have lost everything. Please just show us a little mercy, just for one night. Maya tilted her head, studying the ruined patriarch. The satisfying poetry of the moment was absolute. They were standing in the exact same weather, feeling the exact same freezing, desperate terror she had felt 4 years ago. The universe had brought the ledger perfectly into balance. Maya reached her free hand deep into the pocket of her trench coat. She stepped forward, closing the distance to the gate. Winston and Beatrice looked up, a sudden, desperate flicker of hope igniting in their red eyes. They thought she was reaching for the electronic gate remote. They thought she was finally breaking. Maya pulled her hand from her pocket. She held a single crisp $50 bill. She extended her arm and slid the currency smoothly through the narrow gap in the iron bars. It fluttered down, landing directly in the freezing mud at Winston's ruined shoes. Get an Uber, Maya said, turning her back to them. That's exactly what you told me 4 years ago. Winston stared down at the crisp $50 bill, rapidly soaking up the freezing muddy water at the tips of his ruined leather shoes. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. The ultimate degradation had finally arrived. The former patriarch of the Sterling Empire, a man who once casually signed 7-figure checks over country club martinis, was now staring at a single piece of currency dropped in the dirt by the daughter he had treated like garbage. Beatrice let out a hollow, ragged wheeze. She reached a shaking hand toward the iron bars, her diamond rings catching the harsh white glare of the security floods. She opened her mouth to scream another pathetic plea into the storm, but the sound died instantly in her throat. Before Beatrice could force out a single word, a new light pierced the violent darkness of the torrential downpour. It was not the stark, blinding white of Maya's estate security system. It was the frantic, aggressive, pulsing strobe of red and blue. The shrieking wail of police sirens cut through the deafening roar of the rain, echoing through the dense canopy of the ancient oak trees. Winston whipped his head around, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, slipping in the thick mud as three heavily marked Atlanta Police Department cruisers came tearing down the dark country road. They did not slow down. They swerved violently into the massive driveway, their tires hydroplaning and screeching against the wet asphalt. They formed a tight, aggressive barricade directly behind Winston's leased Mercedes, completely blocking any possible avenue of escape. Seconds later, a massive, unmarked black Chevrolet Suburban roared into the driveway, hopping the curb and sliding to a halt right beside the cruisers. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. Heavy combat boots splashed into the deep, freezing puddles. Half a dozen armed men and women poured out into the storm. They did not wear the standard patrol uniforms of local beat cops. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright, stark yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. Winston threw his hands up instinctively, backing away toward the iron gates as the federal agents swarmed the area with terrifying military precision. Beatrice screamed, pressing her back against the stone pillar, her hands flying to cover her face, as the blinding red and blue strobe lights illuminated the absolute destruction of her reality. Bradley was cowering in the back seat of the leased Mercedes, his face pressed against the tinted glass, his eyes wide with animalistic panic. He fumbled frantically with the electronic lock button, trying desperately to secure the door. It was entirely useless. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face like carved granite, stepped up to the vehicle. He gripped the door handle and yanked it open with such violent force that the hinges shrieked in protest. Bradley Sterling, the lead agent, shouted, his voice booming with absolute lethal authority over the crashing rain. "Step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them. I did not do anything." Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, cowardly whine. He pressed himself against the opposite door, refusing to move. "I am a victim here. Winston made me do it. It was his company." The federal agents did not have time for his pathetic shifting of blame. Two agents reached into the luxurious leather interior of the Mercedes. They grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his expensive tailored jacket and violently ripped him out of the vehicle. Bradley hit the wet pavement hard, his knees buckling under him. He thrashed and flailed, kicking his Italian loafers in the mud, acting like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. "Stop resisting," the lead agent barked. The agents hauled Bradley roughly to his feet. They spun him around and slammed him face first onto the sleek, wet hood of the Mercedes. The impact echoed sharply over the storm. Bradley let out a muffled, agonizing groan as the cold metal pressed against his cheek. "Bradley Sterling, you are under federal arrest," the lead agent announced, retrieving a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are being charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud, 2 counts of interstate embezzlement and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The cold metal cuffs clicked shut around Bradley's wrists, locking tight. "No," Chloe screamed, tearing out of the passenger side of the Mercedes. She lunged toward the federal agents, her face contorted in absolute horror. An Atlanta police officer stepped directly into her path, catching her by the shoulders and easily shoving her backward. Chloe lost her footing entirely. She slipped in the freezing mud and collapsed hard onto the ground. Her designer silk dress instantly soaked up the filthy brown water, ruining the last shred of her manufactured high society image. She sat in the mud, pounding her fists against the wet pavement, wailing hysterically as she watched the agents drag her weeping husband toward the back of the black Suburban. Her golden life, her endless shopping sprees, her massive offshore trust accounts, they were all gone. She was the wife of a convicted federal felon. She would be utterly penniless by sunrise. Winston stood paralyzed against the iron gates of Maya's fortress. He did not move to help his favorite daughter crying in the dirt. He did not move to defend his hand-picked son-in-law being shoved into a federal transport vehicle. He simply stared blankly at the flashing red and blue lights, his mind completely fracturing under the weight of his total eradication. Beatrice slid down the wet stone pillar, dropping to her knees in the freezing mud, her diamond rosary snapping and scattering uselessly across the ground. The immaculate, untouchable Sterling dynasty was dead. Halfway up the long, sweeping driveway, Maya stopped walking. She stood perfectly still beneath the wide, protective canopy of her black silk umbrella, the heavy rain bouncing harmlessly off the fabric. She turned around slowly, looking back down the hill toward the iron gates. She watched the chaotic, frantic masterpiece unfolding in the mud. She watched Chloe screaming in the dirt. She watched Beatrice completely broken and weeping. She watched Winston staring into the void, realizing he had absolutely nothing left. The lead FBI agent finished securing Bradley in the back of the Suburban. He turned around, wiping the rain from his face, and looked through the heavy iron bars of the gate. He saw Maya standing in the distance, flanked by her massive security detail, a silent, untouchable titan observing the wreckage. Maya held his gaze through the storm. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply gave the federal agent a single slow, polite nod of acknowledgement. The agent paused, catching the subtle gesture. He offered a firm, respectful nod in return before turning back to his vehicle. Maya turned her back to the flashing lights, the screaming and the pathetic ruins of the people who had tried to destroy her. She pulled her trench coat tighter against the chill and walked at a steady, unhurried pace toward the massive, glowing front doors of her estate, stepping gracefully into the warmth of the empire she had built entirely on her own. That warmth was not just a fleeting sensation. 7 days later, it had settled permanently into the very foundation of my daily existence. The violent storm that had washed away the Sterling dynasty had completely broken, leaving behind a flawless, brilliant Sunday morning. Sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my estate kitchen, bathing the white marble countertops and custom oak cabinetry in a rich golden glow. The air was thick with the comforting scent of sizzling bacon, fresh vanilla pancakes, and dark roasted coffee. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, silent breakfasts I had endured in Beatrice's dining room. Here there was noise. Here there was life. Leo and Luna darted around the massive kitchen island, their bare feet slapping against the heated hardwood floors. Their bright, unrestrained laughter echoed through the vaulted ceilings, bouncing off the walls with pure, unadulterated joy. They were the living, breathing legacy of the love Marcus and I had built. They were the future Winston and Beatrice had tried to extinguish when they locked me out in the freezing rain. "Got you," Leo shouted, tackling his younger sister playfully onto the plush, oversized sectional sofa in the adjoining family room. Luna squealed with delight, scrambling away and diving straight into the lap of Pastor James. The older man chuckled, his deep, booming voice wrapping around the room like a protective blanket. Pastor James had been the only person to visit Marcus in the hospital when the rest of the world turned away. He was the grandfather my children deserved. He adjusted his reading glasses and held up a brightly illustrated storybook, capturing their attention instantly. "All right, you two wild animals," Pastor James said with a warm smile. "Settle down and let us see what happens to the dragon in Chapter 4. The children instantly quieted, leaning their heads against his shoulders, completely captivated. I stood at the stove holding a silver spatula, watching the scene with a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. This was what generational wealth was actually supposed to look like. It was not meant to be a weapon used to control and humiliate people. It was meant to build a fortress of absolute safety and unconditional love for the people who truly mattered. Sarah bumped her shoulder playfully against mine, breaking my trance. She reached over and expertly flipped a perfectly golden pancake on the cast iron griddle. "You are burning the bacon, Maya," she teased, her eyes sparkling with genuine happiness. I laughed, handing her the spatula. Sarah had been my lead project manager and my fiercely loyal best friend since the days when my company was just a desperate idea typed on a cracked laptop. She had helped me build the empire, and now she was here sharing the spoils of our relentless hard work. I stepped away from the stove, wiping my hands on a linen towel. I picked up my tablet from the marble island and tapped the screen. The morning news updates immediately flooded the display. I leaned against the counter, sipping my coffee as I scrolled through the spectacular ongoing destruction of my biological family. The updates were a masterpiece of absolute poetic justice. Winston and Beatrice Sterling were no longer residing in Buckhead. They were currently living in a cheap two-star motel right off the interstate. The paparazzi had captured a grainy photograph of Winston pacing the cracked concrete balcony outside their room, wearing a stained undershirt. He was smoking a cheap generic cigarette, looking completely haggard and unrecognizable. Beatrice reportedly refused to leave the room, humiliated by the rusted ice machine and the stained carpets. Their bank accounts remained entirely frozen by federal authorities. They were surviving on vending machine food and whatever spare cash they had found in their pockets the night I handed them that $50 bill. Bradley was not faring any better. The federal judge had officially deemed him an extreme flight risk. He was denied bail entirely. The golden boy of the Sterling Corporation was currently sitting in a concrete cell at the Federal Detention Center in downtown Atlanta. He had traded his custom Italian suits for a scratchy neon orange jumpsuit. The financial blogs predicted he was facing a minimum of 20 years for the massive wire fraud and embezzlement scheme he had orchestrated. And then there was Chloe. The federal asset seizure had been completely merciless. Everything tied to Bradley's fraudulent income was confiscated, including Chloe's offshore accounts, her designer wardrobe, and her luxury vehicles. A local gossip site had just posted a candid video of her taken yesterday afternoon. Chloe was wearing a stiff polyester uniform folding clothes at a massive discount retail store in a strip mall. The video showed a rude customer yelling at Chloe about a missing price tag. Chloe just stood there, her ruined manicured hands shaking, forced to swallow her pride and take the abuse because she desperately needed the minimum wage paycheck just to survive. They had worshipped money and status above their own blood. Now the universe had stripped them of both, leaving them absolutely naked to face the brutal reality of the world they had created. I locked the tablet and set it down. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering anger. I simply felt an immense clearing of the air. The toxic infection that had plagued my life was finally eradicated. Sarah reached over and grabbed the remote control resting on the counter. She turned on the massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace in the family room. The local morning news broadcast filled the screen. "Turn it up," I asked, my eyes catching the headlines scrolling across the bottom ticker. Sarah clicked the volume button. The polished news anchor looked directly into the camera, her expression shifting from serious to admiring. "Moving on to local news," the anchor announced smoothly. While Atlanta is still reeling from the shocking collapse and criminal indictment of the Sterling family dynasty, another name is making massive headlines this morning for a very different reason. The screen cut from the anchor to a beautiful aerial shot of the new pediatric wing at Atlanta General Hospital. It was the exact same hospital where Marcus had spent his final days. The massive state-of-the-art facility gleamed in the sunlight. The hospital board officially announced this morning that the new wing will be fully funded and entirely debt-free. The anchor continued, her voice bright and enthusiastic. This monumental achievement is thanks to a record-breaking, completely anonymous donation made late last night. However, sources close to the hospital foundation have confirmed the identity of the donor. A high-resolution professional photograph of me standing in front of my corporate headquarters flashed onto the screen. The board has decided to honor the woman responsible for this unprecedented act of generosity. The anchor stated, her tone ringing with absolute respect. They are officially naming her the philanthropist of the decade. Maya Caldwell has not only revolutionized the tech industry, but she has now secured the future of thousands of children in our city. Sarah turned to me, holding the remote, a massive, proud grin spreading across her face. Pastor James looked up from the storybook, nodding his head in silent, profound approval. Leo and Luna cheered at seeing my face on the television, not entirely understanding the context, but recognizing the victory. I stood in my sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the family I had chosen. I had taken the ashes of their cruelty and forged an empire of absolute, unshakable power. I had won. The morning air was crisp and incredibly clean as I pushed open the heavy glass patio doors. I stepped out onto the sprawling limestone terrace, leaving the warmth of the kitchen behind. Leo and Luna immediately sprinted past me, their tiny boots thumping against the stone as they raced toward the sweeping emerald green hills. I followed them, walking down the wide paved pathway that cut through the exact center of my estate. The landscape opened up before us, presenting a massive cinematic expanse of perfectly maintained equestrian pastures stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky above was a flawless, brilliant blue, completely washed clean by the violent storm that had raged the night before. "Wait up for me," I called out, my voice carrying easily over the gentle morning breeze. The twins did not stop until they reached the thick white wooden fences of the primary paddock. Inside, three majestic thoroughbreds grazed peacefully, their sleek coats shining like polished mahogany in the bright sunlight. Leo climbed onto the lowest wooden rung, gripping the top rail with pure excitement, while Luna bounced on her toes beside him, pointing at the massive, gentle animals. I reached the fence and knelt down into the soft, damp grass, pulling both of my children close to my chest. They smelled of maple syrup and fresh morning air. I rested my chin on top of Leo's soft hair, watching the horses move gracefully across the open field. "Do you know who loved horses more than anyone else in the whole world?" I asked, my voice quiet and steady. "Daddy," Luna said instantly, her bright eyes looking up at me. "That is right," I smiled, smoothing a stray curl away from her forehead. "Your daddy loved them. He always dreamed of having a huge farm just like this one. He wanted a place where you two could run free and be perfectly safe from the rest of the world." "Is Daddy watching us right now?" Leo asked, his young face serious and searching. "He absolutely is," I promised them, pulling them tighter against me. "He is in the wind, he is in the sun, he is right here with us every single day. And he is so incredibly proud of both of you." I looked out over the vast rolling hills, feeling the immense heavy weight of the past 4 years finally lifting entirely off my shoulders. I needed my children to understand the absolute truth about the life we were living. They were surrounded by extreme luxury, by sprawling acreage and massive bank accounts, but I refused to let them become poisoned by it. I refused to let the sterling sickness infect another generation. "Listen to me very carefully," I said gently, turning their faces so they were looking directly into my eyes. "You see this big house? You see these beautiful horses and all this land? This is not what makes us rich. Money is just a tool, it is just paper and metal. It can vanish overnight, as some people recently learned the hard way. Real wealth is something entirely different." "What is real wealth?" Mama Luna asked, tilting her head in pure innocent curiosity. "Real wealth is peace," I explained, my voice filled with absolute conviction. "Real wealth is character. It is knowing exactly who you are and never letting anyone make you feel small. It is surrounding yourself with people who will love you and stand by your side even when you have absolutely nothing left in your pockets. That is what your daddy taught me. That is the greatest treasure you will ever own." The twins nodded solemnly, absorbing the words with the profound, silent understanding that only children possess. They turned their attention back to the horses, completely unburdened, completely free. I stood up slowly, brushing the grass from my knees. I looked back over my shoulder toward the main house. Standing a few yards away, leaning casually against the white wooden fence, were Pastor James and Sarah. They had followed us outside, bringing their warm coffee mugs with them. Sarah met my gaze and offered a soft, knowing smile. Pastor James raised his mug in a silent, respectful toast, his eyes reflecting a deep, profound pride. They did not interrupt the moment. They simply stood guard over our peace, a living, breathing testament to the family I had painstakingly built from the ground up. They were the people who had held my hand through the darkest chapters of my life, and they deserved to share in the radiant light of this victory. I turned back toward the horizon, watching the sun climb higher into the vibrant blue sky. The contrast between my past and my present was absolutely staggering. I thought about the cold, sterile walls of the Sterling mansion. I thought about the suffocating conditional love Winston and Beatrice had weaponized to control every aspect of my life. I thought about the vicious, ruthless betrayal that had left me standing in the freezing rain, holding a sick baby, begging for a single ounce of mercy from people who had no souls. That toxic generational curse was officially broken. It ended the exact moment I refused to let their cruelty define my existence. I had taken their worst blows. I had survived their absolute betrayal. I had channeled every single ounce of my grief, my rage, and my desperation into building an untouchable empire. The sterling name was entirely eradicated, buried under the heavy, crushing weight of federal indictments, offshore asset seizures, and cheap motel receipts. They had tried to bury me alive, but they had completely forgotten that I was a seed. The Caldwell legacy was just beginning. It would be a legacy defined by resilience, by ruthless intelligence, and by the unbreakable strength of a mother who simply refused to be defeated. My children would grow up knowing the value of hard work, the importance of genuine loyalty, and the absolute necessity of protecting those you love. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs completely. The universe possessed a flawless, perfect sense of balance. The scales had been completely righted. Every tear shed, every door slammed, every ounce of suffering had been brutally and beautifully avenged. I looked out at the sun-drenched pastures, my heart absolutely full, my empire completely secure. Karma doesn't always need your help, I murmured to the wind, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. But sometimes a $200 million push makes it much sweeter.